Lianna, the witch of boundless power, master of fire magic, and controller of ice magic, for her plan to destroy the world. She was known as the Scourge of the continent. This witch and her 6 loyal followers are one of the 7 calamities of Runebelt, and she was their queen. Lianna had been a cold and ruthless witch since childhood, effortlessly mastering all the powers she now possessed and showing no mercy to her enemies. At the age of 15, she raised an empire to the ground for defying her, sparking a war and planting the seeds of disaster in Lianna's heart. The witch, without restraint, continued to expand her ranks and sent them across the continent. Those who saw them were terrified, calling them demons. Humanity was on the brink of extinction, and many were prepared to surrender to the witch to end the meaningless and bloody war against her. But the darkness that had enveloped them since the advent of the bloodthirsty, which was suddenly dispelled by a bright light of hope. The people rejoiced, for this light was a hero, someone who could save them from the oppression of the powerful witch. This hero was the Pontiff of Asperia, a man who followed and carried out the will of the goddess Asperia. The people saw him as a savior, but the witch saw the Pontiff as her greatest enemy. At the mere sight of him, her face would twist in disgust. He sickened her. Their war soon escalated into a brutal battle between the Holy Asperia and the Dark faction, a clash of 2 completely different beliefs and morals. The 2 sides fought fiercely for 5 years, neither willing to yield, both trying to hold their ground at all costs. After Lianna's death, the Dark faction signed a treaty with the Holy Asperia. The war ended in peace, and all the events you are about to witness take place 50 years later. The Archbishop was meticulously transcribing the chronicles with a golden-laid violet fountain pen, a portrait of the pontiff visible on the ancient paper. A woman in white entered the room, bowed to the man, and then, with her head lowered, informed him that the pontiff had requested all the goddess's servants to be gathered to his side. The archbishop's hand trembled over the paper, and he gripped the pen tighter, showing how tense Bachman had become at the woman's words. With a look of regret on his face, he turned to the woman who had just entered and stopped writing. The time had come, and Bachman knew it well. All the goddess's servants gathered by the pontiff's bedside, mourning his impending death and listening intently to his final words before he passed into the next world. The pontiff reached his hands upward, speaking incoherently and gasping for breath with every word, saying that the goddess Asperia had not yet abandoned any of them. He raised his hands higher toward the mural depicting the goddess Asperia, saying that she would soon appear before the saints in the form of a child. Thunder crashed outside as the pontiff gave his final order to the goddess's attendants, imploring them to find the holy child as soon as possible, and then breathed his last. The crowd gathered around him began to wail and sob, realizing that the hero of the entire damn continent was dying before their eyes, and they were powerless to stop it. The pontiff's hands went limp and fell onto the bed as he took his last breath and was gone completely. His death was a heavy blow to everyone's morale. The saints conferred outside on how to find the child, worried that the messengers of the calamities would find out, so they decided to keep the news of the pontiff's death a secret for the time being. At that moment, Bachman stood aside, lost in thought, when suddenly a drop of rain hit his face, startling the archbishop from his reverie. A few seconds later, one drop turned into a downpour, as if the sky had split open, sharing humanity's sorrow and shedding tears upon the earth. The rain came without warning, and Bachman heard the cry of a baby. Caught completely off guard, he identified the source of the sound and ran desperately in that direction. The cries came from deep within the forest, which was exactly where the archbishop was headed, completely ignoring minor obstacles like puddles and branches in his path. He burst out from behind another bush, and a faint holy light illuminated his face. Bachman decided to press on and find the source of the light. The glow came from the edge of the fountain, and the closer he got, the brighter the light became, emitting a magical aura as if something otherworldly was happening. As Bachman drew closer, he found a baby in a basket, the very source of the magical glow. The archbishop was dumbfounded by this miracle. The child in the basket was wailing loudly, but calmed down slightly upon seeing Bachman, who believed the baby's arrival was the pontiff's prophecy come true. The archbishop sat down beside the girl, reached out to her, shed tears of joy, and called the baby the Saintess. He, like the other priests, had been waiting for her arrival. The Saintess looked at him as if she completely understood what the archbishop was saying, even stopping her crying as if listening intently to Bachman's words. But her mood changed very quickly, her eyes filling with unprovoked anger toward the archbishop. The girl flew out of Bachman's arms, kicked him in the face, and mumbled something incomprehensible, which roughly meant "stay away from me, get lost." The Saintess, a name that only an incarnation of the goddess could possess, was destined to hold a position even higher than the pontiff. She was supposed to use all her innate powers to save the continent, protect the people from all kinds of disasters, and rescue them from the witch Lianna. But to her own surprise, the Saintess was actually the reborn Lianna, and she had no intention of saving anyone. She was furious at the archbishop's worship of her. The purple eyes and beautiful golden hair were possessed only by the goddess, which was why Bachman confidently called the girl the Saintess. Maria was overjoyed to the point of tears, while George III was convinced that the arrival of the Advent was a blessing for everyone both on and off the continent. The three of them gathered around the Advent, practically clinging to her, thanking her for revealing herself so soon. The child shot them a contemptuous look, bewildered by their ignorance and naivety. There was no way these people could ever guess her true identity. She was annoyed by this whole chaotic situation. She wasn't supposed to have ended up in this body. Lianna remembered every life she had lived. She had been an empire's princess and a will-less slave. She had even been land animals like deer, cats, and birds, and even a fish. Lianna had been reborn as countless different creatures. Tired of this endless cycle of life and death, she decided to try and destroy the world just to break the damn cycle. Lianna was in despair over this rebirth. She had lived over 100 lives and still couldn't stop it from happening all over again. The child began to wail, releasing all her pent-up emotions and forming a halo of holy power around herself. Bachman's jaw dropped in shock. Lianna recognized him, remembered the last time they met, and thought to herself that she was a damn atheist who didn't believe in any goddess. During the Holy War, she had crossed paths with this archbishop, but he was much younger then, more like a holy shield than a man. Since then, he had aged terribly, his face full of wrinkles, sporting a beard, and completely bald. She widened her eyes, trying to figure out how much time had passed since her last rebirth, and then began to miss her friends. Lianna had no idea where they were now, how they were doing, how the war had ended, or what had happened to anyone she knew. She was completely in the dark. Suddenly, Sister Maria gently laid the baby down, which took her by surprise. She gave a sweet smile, told the Saintess she was going to change her diaper, and then, without another word, got right to it. Lianna froze, but it wasn't enough to save her from the fate of a diaper change. Despite her screams protesting the violation of her human rights, the deed was done. It was driving her insane. She clenched her tiny fists, closed her eyes, and tried to hold back the hysterical tears that threatened to pour out. She was on the verge of a breakdown, vowing to reclaim her power and kill everyone involved in this diaper fiasco. After drinking some milk, the Saintess fell asleep in Maria's arms. Maria suggested to Bachman and George that they keep the Saintess's birth a secret to avoid unnecessary trouble. The Archbishop agreed with her, but pointed out that the Saintess needed protection because the dark faction still existed, and he would continue to think about it. But George interrupted him, telling Bachman to calm down, do his job, and assuring him that he and Maria could protect the child. The Saintess would be safe. He was about to say something else, but was cut off by the creak of the huge front door. George and Bachman turned simultaneously toward the sound, sizing up the newcomer. He had arrived at just the right time. Standing in the huge doorway was a young boy, George IV. He looked a lot like his father, but you could tell from his expression that his thoughts were completely different. George was very smart and talented, with the blood of a paladin flowing in his veins, but Bachman thought he was still too young. George III told his son to introduce himself to Bachman and Maria, try to show off how polite he was. The boy just bowed silently in response, while his father made excuses, saying that little George wasn't very outgoing yet. George IV clenched his fists, thinking about why he was here and what his father had just said, concluding that his father was talking nonsense. He had been assigned to protect the Saintess, a task he found incredibly boring. He wanted to be the master of his own life. He only saw the Advent as a little brat, thinking she didn't need any protection at all, and that he himself shouldn't even be dealing with this. The boy remembered his father saying he just had to watch the girl, which infuriated him. He wanted independence, to leave this home. Meanwhile, in the lair of the Dark Faction, they were playing chess and talking about the prophecy coming true and the return of the Advent. The green-haired girl who was moving the queen with magic said she had been waiting a long time for the pontiff to finally kick the bucket and be 6 feet under. The man playing chess with her scolded her for such thoughts and mentioned a proverb saying that a seed planted will grow into a big tree, and if it's not cut down, it will become a problem. He used magic to shatter a chess piece into fragments, showing her the meaning of the proverb. The girl agreed, but kept complaining that nothing could be changed now because the pontiff was dead, his dying prophecy had come true, and the Advent had been born. An arrogant laugh interrupted her. Fire ignited in the girl's eyes as she turned angrily toward the source of the laughter, Jack, who had no right to laugh at her. Jack told the girl to think it over, saying she was being too pessimistic about the future and that they were strong enough to handle the pontiff's prophecy. Jack mentioned the queen's death in his speech, which completely enraged the girl. Her eye began to twitch, and the veins on her face bulged with tension. She screamed at him that he shouldn't have poked at her sore spot and prepared to blast him with magic. Jack also used his own magic to defend and counter. The man on the throne, who had been silently watching them argue, told them to stop. This argument was pointless. They were better off focusing on protecting this place until the queen returned. With that, he ordered Jack to eliminate the Saintess who had appeared. Jack had already planned for it. If it had to be done, he would take care of it now. He walked past the girl toward the exit, and she glared at him with disgust. Jack promised it would be quick and silent. As he left, he told Chrome, the one who gave the order, to take care of the queen and protect this place. The orphan stood before the mage, begging him to train her. The man felt it was pointless, as she wasn't making any progress at all, but she pleaded for one more chance. So the man asked her why she wanted to learn magic, and the girl answered honestly that she had a wish that could only be granted with magic. The man just stared at her without a word, but decided to take her on as a student. He asked the girl for her name, and the child said she didn't have one. The man was surprised and placed a reassuring hand on her back. The man told the girl that from now on, her name would be Lianna, a name that means bright light. Lianna woke up crying again, as she always dreamed of her past teacher and mentor, and those dreams always upset her. Lianna hadn't mastered even the basic skills of magic from the start, not at all. If it weren't for her teacher lending a hand when she needed it, she might never have become the great mage of Runebelt. That man helped her learn the basics of magic, helped her adapt to the world, and became like family to her. He showed her what happiness was, gave her a home, gave her a name with a beautiful meaning, and gave her countless wonderful memories. Their time together was short, but every second she spent with the old man warmed her heart. She celebrated her first magical breakthroughs with him and wanted to reach new heights for his sake. He had practically given her a happy life. And just as easily, he took it all away, stole her happiness, left her without a home, and turned her into a cold and ruthless person. It was he who created a powerful witch, a threat to the continent. It was he who turned Lianna into what she was now. This man also created the forbidden magic that Lianna was now desperately searching for. Remembering all this, she prepared to start searching for her treasure first thing tomorrow morning. She was going to search the entire palace. The goddess's attendants were terrified, begging the Saintess sent by the goddess to protect them from disaster. They were praying because of the messenger from Runebelt who had arrived this morning. He had dared to chop wood shirtless, scaring all the attendants to death. After chopping the wood, he had the audacity to flirt with the servants delivering meals, and his behavior embarrassed them and made it impossible for them to work in peace. The attendants had to confess to the goddess every night, praying that no one like that would ever appear again, and cause them suffering. Little George, passing by, overheard this conversation and stared at the frightened saints, lost in thought. Suddenly, his father called his name, pulling the boy from his thoughts and telling him to keep up and not fall behind. George caught up with his father. He realized the Saintess's decision to announce the pontiff's death was foolish, as now Asperia was crawling with suspicious characters. George III suddenly stopped in front of the Saintess's bedroom, which confused his son. The child turned to his father and saw tears streaming down his face. He was stunned, as his father had always seemed like the type who would never cry. It turned out they were tears of joy that the goddess had not abandoned them, even after the George family had failed the Saints. His father told him not to mess things up with the goddess, who had managed to forgive them despite their ancestors' mistakes. The boy understood, but he was still shocked by his father's devotion. They entered the Saintess's room and found an empty crib. This terrified them. The father rushed out, and George IV, aghast, scanned the room, gripped the hilt of his sword, and turned to run after his father. In one of the building's corridors, he found the Saintess crawling away from them. His father didn't see the child and kept running. Lianna was thrilled with her successful escape. Now she was figuring out how to get into that room, as the doorknob was too high for her. George IV shouted that he had found the girl, who was startled by his sudden appearance and started crawling faster. The boy caught up to the Saintess, grabbed her by the collar, and called her a brat. This enraged Lianna, and she clenched her tiny fists. George IV failed to dodge her precise punch, as the Saintess, with all her might, landed a blow right on his face. As George IV fell, Lianna celebrated that her punch was still as powerful as ever and that she still had her strength. The boy quickly came to his senses, got up, and told her to stay put, but Lianna didn't hear a word. George IV got back on his feet, reached out to the Saintess, and gently pleaded for her to crawl toward him, clearly trying to warn her about something. But Lianna was focused on the boy's words not to go forward, taking it as a clear sign she was on the right path. She picked up speed and charged toward the forbidden area, which terrified George IV. Her little feet kicked up a small cloud of dust, and she was once again thrilled with her successful escape. This girl never listened to anyone. Suddenly, she slipped and began to fall, only then realizing she was at the top of a flight of stairs. She began to understand why the boy didn't want her in this part of the corridor. George IV rushed toward her as the Saintess screamed. They both knew that if she fell, it would be more than just an injury. She would likely die. The boy jumped after her, flying down the stairs with his arms outstretched toward the child. Several terrified attendants of the goddess were watching the rescue. George managed to catch the Saintess, but with complete disregard for his own safety, he slammed onto the floor stomach first. Everyone watching held their breath, and a hush fell over them. The little girl was in George's arms, thankful to be alive. The attendants took her and noticed a scrape on her knee. They ordered George to be tied up, which confused the Saintess. The boy was much more injured than she was. George's father rushed in and was horrified when he heard from the attendants that his son had harmed the precious Saintess and that many had seen it. He confessed his son's sin, went to the attendants, and begged them to punish him instead. Tears began to stream down George IV's face. Someone in the crowd shouted that the entire George family would be put on trial for this, and the boy began to cry, regretting his inexperience. The Saintess watched all this but couldn't intervene. No one would understand her anyway, and in that case, George would surely be executed. Suddenly, she heard a voice telling the attendants to listen to him, someone who had witnessed the whole thing from start to finish. The attendants turned to the speaker, who turned out to be the messenger from Runebelt. The Saintess definitely recognized his voice, realizing he was Jack, the Lustminster, one of the Seven Calamities of Runebelt. Lianna couldn't figure out why he was here, and neither could the attendants, but they still had to hear what the messenger had to say. Jack said that George had saved the child's life, and she stared at him, trying to figure out what he was up to. The minions were afraid of him and didn't want to provoke him. They didn't understand why this messenger from Runebelt was meddling in their affairs. Jack smiled at the crowd, walked over to the bound boy, who was likely doomed with or without an excuse. He opened his hand and reached toward George IV, trying to calm him, and brought his hand close to the boy's face. Jack demanded the minions hand George over to him if they were going to kill him anyway. George was clearly confused by all this, but then he understood what the messenger was saying, and his jaw dropped. The crowd and the boy's father were also stunned to hear Jack say this. The attendant holding the Saintess held her tighter and asked Jack on what grounds they should hand the boy over to him. Lianna tried to figure out what was in it for Jack, but she couldn't understand why he was doing this. She remembered Jack's quirks from her past life. He always believed that love was the ultimate power. He often proposed crazy battle strategies that were all about turning all participants into slaves of love. Lianna was always shocked by his ideas. She realized Jack had always been like this, pulling all sorts of love tricks, respecting every form of love, and being able to make anyone fall in love with him. To be honest, the guy hadn't changed one bit, inside or out, which didn't surprise Lianna at all. While she was thinking, Jack was trying to persuade the minions to hand over the child, saying it didn't matter to them anyway. They began to argue back, questioning Jack, saying he was wrong, and refusing to back down. Jack just smiled, took a graceful step forward, and released a cloud of pheromones with his lustminster power. Everyone around fell silent. Their tongues began to get tied. They started acting drunk, and their cheeks flushed red. Jack was enchanting them with his power. Lianna covered her nose, trying not to inhale the sparkling mist and fall under the messenger's spell. Jack hadn't recognized her yet. He was busy with some plan and didn't expect to find his former queen as a baby in the midst of his enemies. Lianna decided to get the messenger's attention and started screaming in the servant's arms. The girl was startled, and Jack noticed the commotion, turning to look coldly at the Saintess. The attendant put the little girl down, and Jack assumed she was walking toward him, completely under his spell. The Saintess sighed wearily and stood up. The goddess's attendants gasped in shock, as children of this age usually couldn't walk yet. The girl stood unsteadily on her wobbly legs, and all eyes were on her as a murmur of surprise rippled through the room. She began to walk boldly toward Jack, which made the guy incredibly smug. He crouched down, getting closer to the ground because this little lady must be coming to see him. He held out his hands and grinned like a fool. Jack was taken aback when the Saintess walked right past him, snaking around him. The girl walked confidently up to George IV. He was sitting on the floor, and she stood before him, giving the boy a disdainful look, remembering how he had been in her way earlier. The Saintess leaned against his leg and then carefully laid her entire body across George's lap, capturing everyone's attention. The goddess's attendants and Jack stared at her, stunned by the scene, taking it as a good omen. The Saintess was exhausted. She closed her eyes, ready to fall asleep. She was trying to show the attendants that George was a good person and she had succeeded. Jack silently mulled over the situation, and then his expression changed. He smiled at the Saintess, trying to let Lianna know he had seen through her. The girl frowned at him, trying to figure out if Jack had caught on, but she couldn't be sure. After the Saintess voluntarily knelt at his feet, all charges of sin and insubordination against George were pardoned. From that day on, George IV was appointed as the Saintess's knight in the name of his father, George III, much to his shock. Later, the Saintess was settled into her bed, lying alone in a spacious room filled with fresh air. In the small crib, the girl seemed to be asleep, but she suddenly opened her eyes to confirm that everyone had left the room and that the servants were not watching over her. After making sure everyone was asleep, the Saintess carefully climbed out of the crib and headed for the room's entrance, planning to stage another genius escape. She remembered the change in Jack's expression. He had surely recognized her, and the girl's performance had not been in vain. The Saintess carefully pushed a huge chair towards the door to reach the doorknob, trying to ensure she wouldn't be caught this time. The girl reached for the door, but it suddenly opened on its own. The Saintess lost her balance and began to fall towards the doorway. She raised her hands to protect herself, but in her heart, she was already prepared to meet the end of her 101st life. Suddenly, Jack appeared in the doorway and quickly caught the falling Lianna, saving her from dying in such a foolish way. He gazed at the girl's face, called her a little rascal, and then confirmed Lianna's suspicion. He had truly recognized her. Lianna wanted to greet him, but she could only make some muffled, not even human sounds. The girl was very frustrated by this, but at the same time, she was genuinely happy to see Jack. She desperately tried to clearly ask Jack why he was here, but she couldn't. She tried again and failed once more. Frustrated, the girl flew into a rage and began to shout, her voice still muffled. Just then, Jack snapped his fingers, creating a small, bright yellow ball of magic beside him. The Saintess's ability to speak clearly returned the moment she let out a curse, the words tumbling out of her mouth. The sound was perfectly clear. The girl was stunned by her own voice. She widened her eyes and forgot to close her gaping mouth. Jack admitted to using the power of spirits, manipulating them being his specialty. While playing with the spirit he had summoned, Jack asked Lianna if she was happy to see him. Lianna noted that the guy still talked the same way, and Jack retorted that she was as rude as ever. Lianna saw his appearance as a fortunate turn of events. In her previous life, she wanted to use her own powers, but now she could only release divine power. Jack expressed sympathy for her predicament, but she ignored him, only wanting to know how on earth he got here and why Chrome had sent Roosevelt's messenger to Asperia to take revenge on his enemies by killing the Saintess. So now Lianna had become an enemy to her old comrades, which threw her thoughts into disarray. She nervously clenched her fists, while Jack was completely stunned, asking if she really didn't remember her past life. Lianna thought about it. She remembered all her past lives, but she couldn't recall how she had died, as if those memories had been deliberately erased. She only now suddenly realized that this whole business of reincarnation and erased memories of her deaths was incredibly strange. Jack suddenly fell to his knees and burst into tears, startling the protagonist. She stared at him nervously, listening to him wail about how unfair fate had been to Lianna and grieving that she had lost the memory of the day she died. Lianna told Jack to stop crying and tell her everything, because tears wouldn't solve anything. Jack looked up at her dejectedly, and the spirit beside him also drooped. He had to tell Lianna the cause of her death in her past life. On the night before the great battle in the holy city of Asperia, someone had poisoned her at a banquet. On the very eve of their scheduled departure for battle, Lianna gathered with the members of the Seven Sins, raising a toast to their future victory. She gave a rousing toast, telling her comrades that they were invincible and that victory was within their grasp. Afterward, she spoke a few more words of encouragement and raised her cup high. This was her last memory of her previous life. After hearing Jack's story, she was glad that at least her followers had carried on her will after her death and asked Jack where they were now. Jack looked at her with sympathy and said that after the death of the Queen of Calamity, only 6 of them remain. About 50 years after her death, all the members of the Sins began to regret that they had failed to protect her and had missed their chance. The clergy proposed a peace treaty to the Dark Forces, but all the members of the Sins firmly believed the clergy had killed the Queen and thus refused to compromise. At the last celebration with the Queen, only 6 of the Calamity mages were present. 1 person was absent. All the Sins began to suspect the one who was absent from the ceremony, but he vehemently denied it. A pointless argument broke out among the members of the Sins, with everyone suspecting their allies of murdering the Queen. Chrome slammed his fist on the table, the sound loud enough to end the useless clamor. The move worked, and the room fell silent. He convinced his comrades that the Queen would return soon and asked them to protect Runebelt until then, fulfilling their duty to guard the Queen's body until her return. Since the members of the Sins could not trust each other, Chrome only wanted those who were loyal to the Queen to stay. In the end, only 2 people remained. They disappeared down a desolate road to a place where no one knew their whereabouts. Beatrice, the sin of envy, heard that the first sin to leave had gone missing. Chrome looked over her and Jack, surprised that they were still there. Beatrice only stayed to fulfill her dream of having the throne next to the Queen, while Jack stayed for Chrome, because it might be boring for him to wait alone. Chrome didn't thank them, simply turning towards the sunset, thinking they had made the right decision. The members of the Sins gradually forgot the crimes of the clergy, but when news of the Saintess's birth spread, Chrome immediately sent Jack to kill her. But Jack soon realized that this Saintess was the reincarnated Lianna. After finishing his story, he smiled at the girl and asked her to come home with him. The Saintess refused, saying she had not yet found her master's forbidden magic, but she liked the idea of using Jack's spirit power to escape the temple. Jack was caught off guard by her refusal. He placed a hand over his heart with genuine surprise and asked the girl the reason behind her decision. Lianna lowered her head and looked at the floor. Jack realized the forbidden magic was the reason for her refusal and voiced this guess aloud. The girl looked up, meeting Jack's eyes directly. Being reborn as the Saintess was the perfect opportunity to find that treasure. She had spent her entire previous life searching for the forbidden magic created by her master and didn't intend to lose the chance to find it now. Jack argued that, in that case, she should return to Runebelt because there she could regroup her forces and wage war against Asperia. The throne of Runebelt had been empty for too long, and a sense of emptiness invaded the hearts of the Queen's followers whenever they saw it. He knelt before Lianna, saying that all the members of the Sins had been waiting and praying for a long time, and their prayers had finally been answered. He took her hand and asked her to reconsider. Lianna thought about everyone in Runebelt waiting for her, just like Jack, and began to doubt her decision. But she still decided that she needed to be rational at a time like this. She told Jack that their enemies were not as simple as they seemed. Jack's face immediately turned serious, and he lowered his hand. She didn't want to make pointless sacrifices and frankly admitted to Jack that she was only searching for the forbidden magic for her own sake. She still didn't understand the current situation and didn't even know who had killed her, so it was too risky to act now. But Lianna, becoming the Saintess in this latest reincarnation, gave her the perfect opportunity to find the forbidden magic. Jack looked at Lianna with understanding and gave her a small smile, trying to accept the fact that she probably wouldn't change her mind. He picked up the Saintess, carried her to the cradle, and agreed that she would be safe in a baby's body. As he set her down, he said that he wouldn't breathe a word about her in Runebelt until she turned 5. Until then, she needed to be careful so the clergy wouldn't discover her true identity. In the morning, Sister Maria noticed the Saintess was in a bad mood. She was worried about her, as the Saintess needed to sleep well to stay healthy. The girl covered her eyes to shield them from the light, thinking back to last night. She felt that too much time had passed since her last death. She would eventually grow old like all the clergy, but Jack hadn't changed at all since they last met, and he was easily approaching 50. Lianna realized that all her old comrades hadn't aged either, just like Jack. Chrome's blurry face was the first to come to her mind. Thinking of Chrome, she worried that if he found her here, he would burn the entire mighty Asperia to ashes with his rage. Lianna remembered how humiliating it was to die in the arms of her friends on the eve of battle, and Chrome was probably furious with her. Meanwhile, in Runebelt, Jack announced his return to Beatrice, waving and greeting her like a fool. Disgust twisted her face as she threw down her pen and crumpled the paper she had just been writing on. Jack told her he had been to the holy city of Asperia, calling the Saintess his favorite person. Beatrice read between the lines and chewed him out. Jack noticed Chrome's seat was empty and asked Beatrice in surprise where on earth he had gone. She stopped yelling, calmed down, and said that Chrome had just left with a bouquet of flowers. It turned out she was right. He had gone to see the queen, probably having grabbed a few flowers for her from a vase. First, Chrome knelt on one knee before the coffin where Lianna's preserved body lay. He gazed at her, seemingly without emotion. Looking at her lifeless body, he asked when she would return, but received no answer. Lianna's corpse, lying in a coffin filled with flowers, answered him with silence. You would never guess she had died from poison. She looked as if she were merely asleep. The setting sun illuminated the battlefield, casting shadows from the corpses and broken swords on the sand, surrounded by an apocalyptic silence. The majestic figures of the Runebelt messengers looked down on the only living person left on the battlefield, their faces hidden in shadow. Chrome told Lianna that this guy, named George II, was the Empire's strongest holy knight, sent by the Pope of Asperia to eliminate the Dark Messengers. George II surveyed the Dark Messengers. Then his gaze locked onto Lianna, studying her cold eyes intently. Without warning, the guy's eyes widened, and he began to confess his love to Lianna, begging her to let him be her slave. She just stared at him, dumbfounded, unable to say a word in response to the guy's sudden confession. Behind her, Chrome was about to lose control, reaching for his sword. George II was practically asking for a death sentence. Lianna, terrified at what he was about to do, yelled at Chrome to calm down. The Saintess sneezed in her crib. The mere thought of it sent a chill down her spine, and she began to tremble all over. Suddenly, George III appeared with a worried look on his face, scaring her half to death. He asked if she was cold, then picked her up and brought her close to his face, saying he would go get a blanket. The Saintess began to scream, trying to get away from him. The guy was frustrated, and he asked his son why the Saintess didn't like him getting close. George IV figured she was just startled by his sudden appearance. The problem was, Lianna hadn't expected to meet the descendants of the sin of sloth in this life. George II was the sin of sloth, a holy knight from the temple who had long ago betrayed the clergy for a powerful witch. Now she was looking at his two descendants, his nephew and his son. The nephew looked a lot like him, but George IV did not. Suddenly, the Saintess heard a voice ask if she had been waiting long. Her eyes shot open, and she stopped screaming. Sister Maria had come in, holding a soft bundle, apparently having brought a warm blanket for the girl. Tears welled up in the Saintess's eyes, and she was genuinely happy to see Maria, whom she had been waiting for. Maria held the baby tightly in her arms, and the Saintess, won over by the woman's gentle voice and soft hands, thanked her in her heart for the relief. Suddenly, a priest of the goddess peeked his head through the door and asked Maria if the Saintess was with her, and Maria asked what was the matter. The priest said that Lord Buckman requested an audience and that the Saintess needed to see him. This was it. George IV asked Maria when Buckman had become a lord. Wasn't he just an archbishop? Maria said he would soon be the new pope. She reminded him that it was Buckman who found the Saintess, and now he was about to attain the highest position in the church so that he wouldn't have to bow to anyone. Escorted by George, Maria carried the Saintess into Buckman's office. Lianna thought to herself that it was impossible for anyone to be more influential than the incarnation of the goddess. Buckman asked Maria and George to leave him alone with the Saintess, saying he had something to tell her, and took the baby from Maria's arms. Buckman said it wouldn't take long, and the Saintess was surprised, realizing he was about to speak to a baby who, at her age, shouldn't be able to understand anything. With this thought, she guessed that Buckman had discovered her true identity, but with a bang, the former archbishop began to speak, interrupting her thoughts. Buckman told her about the first pope, the one who built this temple and left a mural of the goddess inside. The mural depicted the goddess in human form, which was the last message the clergy received from her through the pope. The child watched the painting intently, listening to the man, but it took her a moment to understand what he was saying. Buckman tilted his head, his face darkening in the shadows, and told the Saintess in a heavy voice that no member of the clergy had received any revelation from the goddess. Not since then. The girl was hit hard as Buckman's words finally sank in. She realized that everything the last pope had said was a lie. So the pope had always been a fraud, the Saintess thought, and the Asperia temple had been lying to people for over 500 years while preaching divinity. Even so, the goddess had not abandoned her servants. She sent a second revelation in the form of a holy child, her own incarnation. He held the Saintess up to the statue of the last pope, saying it was he who had prophesied her birth. The stone statue of this great man just looked down silently at the girl who had appeared. Lianna looked up at the statue with her head held high, thinking what a damn irony it was, as she didn't have very fond memories of that guy from her past life. Bauman told the child that this truth and others had been passed down through generations of clergy in their chronicles, and now it was his turn. He revealed the apocalyptic prophecy the goddess had left 500 years ago, and about the great witch Asperia, who sought the forbidden magic. They struck down the witch, but even in death, her followers constantly tried to find that forbidden magic, never giving up. He thanked the Saintess for her appearance, saying that it was no exaggeration that she was the clergy's last hope, a sign that the goddess had not abandoned them. The child lowered her gaze to the floor, pondering the new pope's words and silently disagreeing in her heart. Bauman and the other servants of the goddess saw the Saintess as their last hope. They believed in her and hoped she would save them. But they didn't know that this Saintess was actually an impending disaster, someone who would shatter all their dreams, hopes, in this entire world. Lianna found the whole thing comical, and she let out a quiet chuckle, enjoying how easy this all was for her. Lianna felt that this goddess didn't exist at all, but if she did, she had made a huge mistake by reincarnating Lianna in this child's body. After Bauman finished speaking, the girl thought she should ask him where the forbidden magic was. She tried to tell him she wanted to see it. Suddenly, Bauman's entire demeanor changed. A shadow fell over his face, and his eyes became vacant. Seeing his transformation, the girl remembered Jack's warning that if the priest discovered her true identity, they wouldn't just let her go. A cold sweat broke out on her face as she glanced wearily at the new pope, anxiously waiting for what would happen next. The man's face tensed, his hands began to tremble, and then his whole body started to shake. His eyes widened as he was lost in thought. The child began to wonder what would happen to her if Bauman found out her true identity, though he didn't seem smart enough to connect the dots. Without warning, the man rushed towards the door, carefully holding the little girl in his arms. He slammed the door open, shouting for Sister Maria to know that the Saintess had been very busy. Lianna's eyes and mouth were wide open in silent astonishment at the Pope's denseness, watching as everyone began to fuss over her. Bauman handed the Saintess to Maria, who noticed the child's unusually pale face and frantically started looking for a place to change her diaper. Bauman stepped back a bit, relieved that he didn't have to change the baby's diaper himself. The man tensed his arms, grabbed a pillar, and a bright light shone from under his hands. The veins on his face bulged as he gritted his teeth and lifted the massive pillar with great effort. Maria watched as if it were a common occurrence and smiled, telling the Saintess to go see her new stone crib. Bachman was glad he had managed to slip away. Maria thanked him and assured the Saintess she would change her diaper right away. Lianna frowned. Those muscles shouldn't have impressed her, as her own power had been far greater. But she decided to wait until she could actually speak before trying to ask the clergy about the forbidden magic again. She just had to wait. Next we see the same place, but 5 years later. Bauman is helping a common servant carry heavy sacks, for which they are very grateful. It was no problem at all for the Pope, who was just happy to help ordinary people with their daily chores. The servants of the goddess watched them, talking about the thick hair Bauman had grown after receiving some kind of blessing. One of the servants asked what kind of blessing it was, and the girl opposite him was about to answer when the Saintess rushed past her. In the bright morning light, the girl in a fluffy, pale pink dress ran while shouting the Pope's name. The man answered her call, a happy smile spreading across his face when he saw the girl. The Saintess ran straight towards him, her dress and thick blonde hair flying in the wind from her rapid pace. Running closer, the Saintess jumped up to try and hit Bachman, but he raised his arm in time to block it. The girl shouted that Bachman was supposed to take her somewhere, while the man just smiled foolishly, thanking the Saintess for deciding to grace him with her presence. Suddenly, they all heard a woman's cry, faintly coming from deep within the building, calling for the Saintess to come back. The girl turned and ran towards the sound, announcing to everyone that she was leaving. The servants commented that the Saintess was very energetic. As always, the little Saintess was now 5 years old, and for 5 years, she had been trying to find out from Bachman where the forbidden magic was kept, but each time the girl received the same answer. Bachman said he would tell her about the magic when she grew up. Lianna realized the guy wouldn't tell her anything until she was an adult, so she decided to figure the damn thing out herself. The Saintess ran towards the sound she had heard while talking to Bachman, which turned out to be Sister Maria looking for her to get her ready for the upcoming dinner. The child giggled while hiding behind some pillars, realizing she was slowly gaining a kind of power over all these people, even though she was just a child. She was also excited because she could finally connect to the divine power she had gained upon her rebirth. No problem, though she wasn't thrilled that the first great display of her power was curing Bachman's alopecia, that balding disease. She decided she would get to the bottom of things today, when suddenly she heard a creepy voice from the darkness flatly state that he had finally found the Saintess. The girl looked at the man, noticing his strange energy, his face completely hidden under a hood. Without warning, he pulled a sharp knife from his belt. This guy was up to no good, muttering praises to Runebelt. The glint of the knife flashed in the Saintess's eyes as she carefully observed the man, and when he screamed die at her, she sprang into action. She leaped high into the air and kicked the man in the stomach, telling him to say that again. The assassin doubled over, spitting saliva, stunned by the little girl's strength, unable to figure out how a normal child could be so strong. Chrome's words flashed through his mind, reminding him not to underestimate her just because she was a child. His hood slipped off, and he lay on his back on the cold floor, still trying to recover from the blow. The girl planted a foot on his chest, looking down on him, casting a shadow over his face, contemptuously calling him an old man and forcing him to look her in the eye. She told him that since he was going to die anyway, he might as well satisfy her curiosity before he went. The man was furious that the Saintess thought he would spill secrets so easily, and he began to frantically fumble inside his clothes, looking for a suicide pill. The girl was one step ahead, presenting the poison capsule she had already found in his clothes and stolen while punching him. She told him he shouldn't give up his life even when facing overwhelming danger. She crushed the poison capsule with her divine power, saying she wouldn't let him die so easily. The Saintess smiled ominously and moved closer to him, ordering him in a voice of steel to answer her questions. The guy passed out, and Lianna, angry upon realizing this guy knew nothing, cursed him for being a complete waste. The Saintess found a knife on the man, thinking that maybe Jack was right and assassins were starting to appear in the temple. She figured that if the assassins came one by one, they wouldn't know her true identity. In the reflection of the flashing blades, she saw her past life. Lianna didn't mind the increasing number of assassins, but having to clean up their mess, erase their memories, and hide their weapons without getting any information was just terrible. She wanted to ask these guys how her friends were doing, but on second thought, they were probably fine. After all, they were magically immortal and wouldn't die of old age. George IV appeared before the Saintess, excited to have finally found her, and told her that Maria had been looking for her everywhere. The Saintess pointed to the person on the ground, saying he had only fainted, and pretended to be upset about being found next to a body yet again. Maria praised the Saintess for finding the man so quickly, pointing out that this wasn't the first time. The girl just felt embarrassed. She sighed in silent relief. The servants of the goddess were clueless about this, which was exactly what the Saintess wanted. George IV was a hindrance in her search for magic, and if the clergy found out about the assassins, they would surely tighten security. Maria walked over to the Saintess, stroked her head, and wished her a good night. The girl even enjoyed this carefree atmosphere. As the Saintess drifted off to sleep, Maria quietly left her room, closing the door behind her and pausing in front of it for a moment. Sister Maria's face was hidden in the shadows, her lips pressed into a thin line. She left silently, trying not to make a sound. In a brightly lit room, the servants of the goddess sat around a large triangular table. Bachman sat at the head, and one seat was empty. The door suddenly creaked open loudly, and all the servants turned their heads, their eyes wide. Two guards opened the door, and Sister Maria walked in, bowing her head to apologize for being late. Bachman gave her a sweet smile, saying she didn't need to apologize as everyone had just arrived. He added that Maria looked worried. Bachman gestured for her to take the empty seat. After Maria sat down, the Pope declared the meeting regarding the Saintess officially open. The clergy discussed how priests had recently been found unconscious with memory loss, and today a dangerous weapon was even found next to one of them. But what the servants of the goddess found most terrifying was that these incidents always happen near the Saintess. Bachman said that in light of everything that was happening, they needed to assign more guards to the Saintess. Two of the goddess's servants agreed. Omar, one of the servants, was angered by this and objected. He said the church was already bankrupt, and two others supported him. Bachman considered his point, then turned to Sister Maria and asked for her opinion. Maria was startled by his question. She placed a hand over her heart, looked at Omar, and said, "Yes, perhaps a little more security wouldn't hurt. Just in case." Right now, only George was guarding the Saintess, and that wasn't enough. They couldn't be stingy when it came to protecting the Saintess. Omar lost his temper, shouting that he wasn't against more guards, but that the clergy was flat broke and simply couldn't afford it. The clergy ignored him completely, talking about the decline in donations, yet they still believed the church had money somewhere. Archbishop Omar sighed, pressing a hand to his forehead. These priests knew nothing about finances. He was in charge of the money, and this was about to give him an aneurysm. Omar pleaded with the servants of the goddess not to even mention more guards until they had more money. Maria was just thinking quietly. Suddenly, she stood up, raised her hand, and said that if money was the problem, she had a solution. Lianna stood silhouetted against the setting sun, her face shrouded in shadow, about to tell Chrome some truths. Chrome gazed at her intently, all ears. She told him that even after she died, she would remember this life, and that she would definitely return to Runebelt. The heroine handed Chrome the elixir of immortality, saying that if he used it, they could meet again in a few decades. She held his hand tightly, pleading with him to protect Runebelt if she died before obtaining the forbidden magic. This was all Chrome's memory, the contents of that conversation he was pondering. Just then, a hooded figure pulled him back to reality. Chrome admitted he had zoned out a bit and asked him to repeat himself. The man said the temple was increasing its security and holding a selection tournament to recruit more guards. Chrome picked up a flyer for the tournament and saw that there was an entry fee. He couldn't believe those holy rollers were charging people who wanted to work for them. The hooded figure guessed they were beefing up security because of the recent attacks. Chrome asked if there was any news on the last suicide attacker. It turned out the last attacker they sent had completely lost his memory and ended up serving the clerics. Chrome silently processed this. He felt there was no way those stupid priests could have pulled this off. The Saintess herself must be behind the whole thing. No sooner had he finished speaking than Jack appeared outside the window, thrilled at the mention of the Saintess's name, which startled the other guy, but Chrome didn't even blink. Chrome guessed Jack was using his psychic powers to eavesdrop again. Jack completely ignored him, practically dancing as he asked if they were really talking about the Saintess. When no one answered, he begged to go to the tournament, saying he would be eternally grateful if Chrome let him. Chrome sighed heavily, leaned against the table, and told Jack no way. Jack was completely stunned. Chrome stood up, his expression darkening, and announced that he would personally go to the tournament held by the church. Jack was shocked and tried to dissuade Chrome, saying he could use his psychic energy to hide his power, but Chrome would be discovered immediately if he went. Chrome cut him off, saying everyone knew Jack was the emissary of Runebelt, and if he showed up, the plan would be exposed instantly. Jack tried again, asking who would manage Runebelt if Chrome left. Chrome just rubbed his ring in response, saying nothing. Then he took off the ring and tossed it. The ring erupted in blue flames, which then slowly turned green. The ring ended up in Beatrice's hands. She had never imagined Chrome would entrust her with something so important. Beatrice swore to prove herself a first-rate leader and let Chrome stay away for as long as possible without worrying about a thing. Chrome said he trusted her, while a dumbfounded Jack started shouting, begging Chrome to hear him out. In response, a blast of blue fire magic shot towards him, making Jack leap back in terror. Chrome blamed him for this. The reason the corrupt temple began to rise was because Jack had let the Saintess go 5 years ago, and Chrome was beginning to suspect him of treason. Chrome pointed out that Jack used to be obsessed with Lianna, but now he had suddenly shifted his attention to the Saintess. He said he was slowly starting to believe that the Saintess was Lianna's reincarnation, or something similar. Jack was terrified and shut his mouth. Chrome announced that he had to investigate everything himself and decide whether the Saintess deserved mercy. The priests were finally going to officially announce the girl's existence, and the Saintess was furious about it. Maria also told her that because of this announcement, the security around her would be strengthened, and the strongest and best people on the continent would gather at the church for her. The Saintess shouted that she didn't want that, pointing at George and saying his protection was more than enough. George bowed and reminded her that the Saintess was always saying how annoying he was, and he was sorry that he would have to leave her soon. The Saintess had only shouted to get rid of George, not to get a new guard detail. Maria wiped a breadcrumb from the corner of the girl's mouth, insisting this was for her own good and asking her to understand the servants of the goddess. The Saintess thought to herself that since she hadn't found the forbidden magic yet, extra security would only make the search more difficult and slower. The girl couldn't stop the tournament, so she decided to find another way to prevent the security upgrade, which caught George's attention. The Saintess went up to George, grabbed his cloak, and begged him not to leave, saying she liked him and that's why she always teased him. This made George incredibly emotional, and he shed tears. Sister Maria, watching from the side, just smiled sweetly. George knelt before the girl, thinking he could never guess what the Saintess was thinking, because she was always yelling at him. The Saintess told him to enter the tournament in a tone that brooked no argument, which both shocked and surprised him. The girl looked at George with a triumphant and determined smile, while he just shouted in desperation, asking the Saintess what she meant by this. King George III gave a grand speech, congratulating everyone who had passed the preliminaries. He said they were all qualified to become the Saintess's guards. The king declared the tournament open, raising his hands triumphantly as the crowd before him roared in approval. Back in the crowd, George IV sighed helplessly, a drop of sweat trickling down his temple. He was clearly under immense pressure. The boy recalled how he had ended up here, how the Saintess had unexpectedly asked him to participate in this tournament. She had pleaded with him to show his abilities for her sake, to defeat all his opponents and win. George tried his best to refuse, but the girl gently took his calloused hand and said she had already chosen him to be her guard. She declared that her decision wasn't just based on his strength, but on the effort he put in when he was by her side, and only she knew that the Saintess was doing her best to encourage him. She told him to win the tournament so that everyone would know that only George could be her guard, no one else. George looked at the girl in surprise, but replied that he understood her command and would carry it out at any cost. The boy clenched the hand the Saintess had touched, vowing to become the strongest so that no one would dare have any disrespectful thoughts about the Saintess's reputation. Behind George, two guys were making snide remarks, saying he got a pass to the main tournament without going through the preliminaries because he was the son of a paladin. They said the kid didn't stand a chance. Only one person in history had ever passed the preliminaries on their first try. One of them was trying to remember the guy's name, and then it came to him. It was Chrome. Chrome himself suddenly appeared behind them, startling them, and told them to move in a low voice. The Saintess sat having her hair brushed under the watchful eyes of the nuns, the girl looking at a document handed to her with a puzzled expression. It turned out to be the financial report on the tournament's income, which Omar had given to the Saintess. Maria didn't understand why they would show this to the girl. The Saintess stared thoughtfully at the document, trying to make sense of it. Her eyes narrowed and a finger placed on her lips. She was shocked to discover that nearly 9,000 people had come to compete and said so out loud. Omar was thrilled about the funds for rebuilding the temple. The income from entry fees was far less than that from the Saintess's portraits, which were selling like crazy. The girl asked how many had been sold. Omar replied that it was about 10 per person, and they had just received an order for 10,000 from the Northern Kingdom. The Saintess praised Omar and Maria for conceiving and arranging it all. She had to admit she'd never thought of such a way to make money. The girl trusted Omar and asked him to make sure the money was spent on the right people. Omar just stared at her, dumbfounded and completely in awe. He became emotional and frantically swore his loyalty to the Saintess. The girl just gave him a puzzled look. Suddenly, a brilliant idea flashed in her mind, and she began to consider going to see the tournament in person. The scene was a brutal battle, with the sounds of fighting ringing out incessantly. These men were fighting with all their might for the right to guard the Saintess. The contestants fought in pairs in a clearing, with the servants of the goddess watching from the side, judging the outcome of the fights. The Saintess snuck to the edge of the battlefield, hiding behind some wooden crates to watch the tournament. She was surprised to find the Scourges of Rune Belt among the contestants. She felt that any one of them could easily become her guard. She was thinking about Jack and Beatrice, trying to decide who she would want to guard her, when something on the battlefield caught her attention. The organizers were asking the contestants to introduce themselves before their matches. The Saintess leaned out to get a better look and froze on the spot. The girl saw Chrome from behind and was stunned by his presence, but she couldn't be sure it was him. Yet looking at him, she remembered a young Chrome complaining that the holy power of the temple residents made him extremely agitated. Lianna had walked over to the boy, gently stroking his head and telling him not to compare himself to others. The girl told Chrome that he, the other 6 mages, and her teacher were all her family, and she saw them all as equals. Lianna promised the boy she would be his everything, and in return, he looked at her with big, hopeful eyes, trusting her completely. The girl remembered the good times she spent with the sins of Runebelt, little Chrome, cheerful Jack, and the others. She remembered Chrome as a little boy who loved to laugh, remembered how he grew up before her eyes, remembered the way he smiled at her when they met, and how much he believed in her. But those memories faded when Lianna saw the Chrome before her now, a serious man who had nothing in common with the boy in her memory. Chrome introduced himself, stating his full name and that he was 18 years old. The servants of the goddess and the contestants were all captivated by him. Lianna was shocked at how young Chrome looked. She had thought he was over 25 and decided this couldn't be the Chrome she once knew. She tried to convince herself that this was just someone who looked and sounded like him. Besides, Lianna noticed she couldn't feel any magic from him. But if this guy was the Chrome she knew, then he would definitely win this tournament. She remembered teaching Chrome how to fight, how to hold a sword, giving him pointers on his attacks, and drilling into him how to win. She froze when she saw the guy assume the very stance she had repeatedly taught Chrome all those years ago. His opponent charged at Chrome, ready to teach him a lesson, but Chrome just stood there calmly. In an instant, however, he tightened his grip on his sword and exploded forward, his eyes burning with rage, knocking his opponent's sword from his hands in a single blow. The man was stunned by Chrome's power, his hands trembling from the impact. But through the pain, he saw that Chrome had also thrown away his sword. So he rushed forward, trying to get in a cheap shot. Chrome wasn't having it. He instantly closed the distance, raising his hand to knock the man out with a single punch, his face a mask of pure rage. He grabbed the guy's face and slammed his head into the ground. The man was caught off guard and didn't even have a chance to fight back. Chrome looked down at the guy, who was unconscious in the dirt, his head having made a small crater in the ground, and snarled, "Weakling." The Saintess lost her footing in shock and collapsed, making a noise. An attendant noticed her and found her. It had to be Chrome. She had felt all of his magic in that attack. He was just using the weapon as a feint. People noticed the Saintess, asking if it was really her. The goddess's attendant was terrified. Chrome locked onto her too, staring at her with a cold, hateful gaze, as if he wanted to kill her. The Saintess looked into his empty eyes and tensed up, realizing that Chrome was planning to take her out. Two guys were talking about George IV again, but this time they were acknowledging his victory as he had made it to the finals. They admitted they hadn't taken the kid seriously because of his age and didn't think he'd get far. It turned out George was stronger than they thought. Still, there was no way George could win again. His next opponent was Chrome, whom he had been lucky enough to avoid until now. Chrome was stronger to begin with, and now the kid was injured with a broken arm. He had no chance now. They thought all the kid's skills came from being a paladin, completely unaware of how hard he had worked to get where he was today. The guys thought the kid was a total weakling who was just here to put on a show. They also questioned his lineage, saying he only got into the tournament because someone pulled strings, which was so unfair to the other contestants. They thought George had no talent, completely unaware of how hard he had worked to get better or the hardships he had endured. The Saintess appeared before George, checking his injuries. She wasn't surprised by this, and she looked at him with a stern gaze. George apologized to her and then broke down in tears. The Saintess told him it was too early to apologize, but in her mind, she was trying to accept that it was all over. Her life depended on George's fight with Chrome, and she needed to give him some words of encouragement, but he was in such bad shape she didn't know where to start. Through his tears, George told the Saintess that he really wanted to show her his abilities and prove he was stronger than everyone else. The girl listened carefully. She had been in the same situation herself. She began to remember when she was just a child. She remembered apologizing to her teacher, saying she really wanted to impress him, but she had messed up the magic, and all the stones had spilled from the cauldron. The girl trembled, waiting for her teacher's disappointment and anger for burning his treasured books. He examined one of the charred pages. The man asked Lianna if she knew the meaning of her name, reminding her that it meant light and that she shouldn't worry about small things. Those memories faded into her teacher's death. A knight in armor executed him in front of everyone as rain poured down. The girl's eyes were glued to the staff that the men had taken from her teacher's hands. It looked tattered and broken. Lianna was terrified and on the verge of tears. Her teacher's blood was washed away in the rain. His skin looked unnatural, and people just watched him die as if it were a show. The Saintess's thoughts snapped back to a sunny day, remembering how happy her teacher was that she hadn't been hurt in the book-burning incident. The Saintess clenched her fists and decided to walk over and pat George on the head. The boy was very surprised and asked what she was doing. She told George he did a good job, calling him her knight. He was just a kid and had plenty of time to get stronger. It was okay to mess up. Everyone fails, and it will happen many more times. But today, George did a good job. That was enough. The boy cried even harder, which completely startled the Saintess. She figured George had been bottling up all his emotions, which was why he was crying so hard. George opened his arms and hugged the Saintess, and she hugged him back. The atmosphere of this temple had affected her. She had become too soft. But the Saintess thought that maybe she did it because she had once been in George's shoes, but she decided not to dwell on it. The Saintess told George to keep it a secret, that she had used her holy power to heal him, and told him to go fight without any regrets. George nodded enthusiastically. He understood. The girl was amazed at how quickly the dejected boy had cheered up. George offered to walk her back to her room, but she refused, intending to go back on her own. George nodded in response and thanked the Saintess for her help. The Saintess turned, gave him a bright smile, and said, "I'll only accept your thanks after you've won." The girl walked down the empty hallway, regretting that she had refused George's help because using that holy power had really drained her. She was exhausted. The Saintess was happy when she spotted Sister Maria looking for her up ahead and was about to run over and tell her she was here. The girl opened her mouth to call the nun's name, but a man suddenly appeared from behind her and stopped her. He covered the Saintess's mouth and dragged her around a corner. deeper into the hallway. The girl struggled desperately. Maria heard nothing and walked right past. The man ordered the girl to shut up, and she was trying to figure out how he had approached her so silently, as she had always been able to notice the suicide attackers before. She decided to stop thinking about it and bit the man's hand. His skin turned a sickly color, and he screamed in pain. The Saintess fell to the floor as the guy cursed. She couldn't figure out why she couldn't feel his magic, which was usually very bright. She decided to worry about it later and used her holy power, which she thought would quickly drain his strength and make him give up. But to her surprise, nothing happened to him. A blow like that should have taken him down, but the holy attack had no effect. He approached the Saintess, raising his hand to strike. She was too slow to react. The man struck her in the back, pinning her to the ground and laughing at her helplessness. She looked up at his face through the pain, and standing above her was a priest. It dawned on her. That's why her holy power didn't work on him. The priest began to ramble on about overthrowing the temple, saying the Saintess was to blame for all their failures, and pulled out a knife. The girl realized she had no strength to fight back as the man raised the knife, ready to kill her without mercy. He smiled triumphantly, completely convinced he had won. But just then, another person appeared behind him and swung, hitting the priest hard on the back of the head. The priest fell face first to the ground, knocked out cold. The Saintess looked up in terror at the man, towering over her. It was Chrome. The girl tried to figure out his intentions. She thought he was going to take her out, but now he was playing the hero, leaving her thoughts in a jumble. Chrome called her by her new name, catching her off guard. She struggled to keep her composure and not give away her identity. Chrome knelt on one knee before her, asking how she had ended up like this, and calling her by her real name, Lianna. In an instant, she flashed back to the past. Lianna was playing chess with Chrome, telling him stories from her life, and saying she didn't believe in love. She claimed love was a complete lie, because even the men who swore they loved her never recognized her after she was reborn. She looked up at Chrome and saw him looking down, gazing at her with a melancholic expression. She asked him what was on his mind. Chrome said he couldn't just laugh off a story like that. Lianna looked down at the table, thinking about what he said. Chrome said he could never make a mistake like that. Lianna was completely stunned, her eyes wide. The girl thought about how serious Chrome's tone was, which left her feeling overwhelmed and speechless. Chrome asked Lianna why she had that expression, but the girl was confused because no one had recognized her so far. Not Jack, not even the strongest mages. She made a questioning sound. Chrome leaned in towards her, staring silently and sternly at the girl's face. He moved closer and asked if Lianna really didn't remember anything. The girl tried hard not to show her distress, lest she expose herself. She realized that if Chrome saw through her identity, he would take her away, and in the worst-case scenario, it would start a war, and she would never be able to get the forbidden magic. She tried to pretend she was just an ordinary child, squeezed out a few tears, and said she was really scared and almost cried, pretending to know nothing. Chrome's expression turned cold. The girl addressed him as Sir Knight and thanked him for saving her, while noticing his serious expression and the chilling atmosphere around him. Maria found the two of them, shouted the saint's name, and asked what was happening here. The girl was so happy to see her that she jumped up at once. Maria checked her face, noticed the saint was badly hurt, and asked if she had run into any danger. The girl replied that she was saved just in time. Chrome stood up, informed Maria about the assassination attempt on the saint, and proposed to take the killer away for interrogation and torture to find out who was behind it. Maria sincerely thanked him for saving the saint. The girl watched him warily, but Chrome said nothing more, just stared at the girl with a hint of sadness, apologized politely, and then turned and walked away. Bauman was terrified to hear about the assassination attempt on the saint. His eyes widened in panic, and he began to speak, his voice almost a shout. Maria was discussing with him that perhaps they should postpone the tournament finals, as they hadn't caught the mastermind yet, and it could be dangerous. Bauman agreed with her. The saint called their names, and Maria and Bauman whipped around, looking at the girl with interest, ready to hear what she had to say. The girl stood by the window, said she was fine, and asked them to hold the finals as planned. Bauman tried to dissuade her, but the saint cut him off, saying the tournament was the perfect place to announce her existence, as many people looked down on her. The girl thought to herself, yeah, she wasn't thrilled about being reincarnated as the saint, but she definitely didn't want to die at someone else's hands. Bauman placed a hand on his heart, knelt on one knee before the girl, and bowed his head. He swore to the saint that he would protect her forever. forever. The Pope turned to the attendants of the goddess and ordered them to tighten security and halt the tournament immediately if any suspicious individuals were found. He told them not to forget that the saint was the most important person right now. The girl looked at them with a stern gaze, and all the attendants replied in unison that they understood the order. The saint kept wondering how Chrome knew when everyone else was completely convinced she was the real one. She stood on the sun-drenched balcony, turning it over and over in her mind, looking down at the battlefield below with a blank expression. Spread out before her was a huge, empty field where only Chrome and George stood, and you could see the tension in her posture. She still couldn't figure out what Chrome was up to, but she had resolved to do what she had to do, no matter what. Watching the fight unfold, the saint noticed all the scars on George's body, which meant he had fought his way to get to this point. She said that everyone here was cheering for these men, whose strength had already been proven, regardless of the outcome. She raised her hand, made a gesture of blessing, and wished them a good fight. The final round of the tournament, George IV versus Chrome, began. A fierce battle was underway between George and Chrome, with neither giving an inch, both using everything they had. Chrome looked fearless, commenting on how disgusted he was by divine power. George's brow furrowed as he stared him down, sweat pouring down his face. The boy was exhausted, but he was determined not to give up. Bauman asked the saint who she thought deserved to win more, but honestly, she would have given the victory to both of them. She noted how different they were. George worked desperately hard to become good, but Chrome, he had always been naturally gifted. With that thought, her mind drifted back to the past, to when Chrome showed her the stone bird he had made with magic as a child. Lianna couldn't look away. She was stunned by his talent, especially since she hadn't even been able to make the bird on her first try. Chrome was thrilled to have succeeded on his first attempt, saying over and over that it was all thanks to Lianna, and he desperately wanted her to praise him for doing a good job. But she was speechless. All these emotions, jealousy for his talent mixed with happiness for him, were tangled together. When she finally collected herself, she just gave him a dry good job. The saint stared into the distance, lost in thought, but her eyes were fixed on the battlefield. Chrome began to notice this, and he turned to her, wondering what was making the saint so distracted at this moment. Big mistake. Chrome, your opponent has very impressive close combat skills, and George spotted that moment of hesitation and swung his sword swiftly. Still, Chrome was able to block the next blow. He slammed his sword hard against George's, but George managed to hold on to his weapon. Even so, George IV had grazed Chrome with the first strike, the sharp blade leaving a clear scratch on his cheek. George, feeling he had found his opponent's weakness, decided to back off slightly and wait for the perfect moment to attack. But Chrome was starting to get angry, and he began to press down hard with his sword, causing George's legs to feel weak and making it harder and harder to stand his ground. Chrome said his patience was running out, that he didn't have to play this game of weapons, and that he was going to crush George with a single blow and end it all. But his plan was interrupted by the sharp cries of the goddesses and Bauman's attendants, who were shouting the saint's name. Chrome whipped his head around. He saw the saint's small body plummeting from the high balcony at an incredible speed, with no one even trying to catch her. 5 minutes earlier, an attendant of the goddess had rushed onto the balcony at full speed, her sprint making the guards tense up. But they let her pass to see Bauman, who was also surprised by the girl's sudden appearance, which distracted him from the match. The girl, out of breath, explained that something had collapsed during temple repairs, and many people were trapped under the rubble, and the priests couldn't help them. Bauman frowned, which unsettled him, and he decided to go to the scene himself to help the victims. He had meant to inform the saint of his decision, hoping someone would stay with the girl, just in case something happened, but she didn't even notice him. The girl was watching the fight on the field with rapt attention, completely absorbed. Maria smiled at the sight, thinking how cute the saint looked, so focused on the match that she couldn't even hear the people talking behind her. The saint thought that even though Chrome clearly had the upper hand on George, that guy was resisting with all his might and was actually making progress. She was wondering what would happen to Chrome if George won, when suddenly a woman rushed onto the balcony from behind her. Maria tried to shout and stop her, which caught the saint's attention, but it was too late. The attendant was already close enough. The woman said that the saint's death will be Bauman's downfall. The people behind her screamed, frozen in terror. The saint just stood there, speechless. The attendant gave the girl a hard shove, and she flew off the balcony, back first. The crowd, Bauman, a horrified Maria, and the guards all screamed. The fall only lasted a few seconds, but but she still had time to think about death. The girl decided that, all in all, this life hadn't been too bad. She barely had time to think about how she hadn't found the forbidden magic or met her followers, because a moment before she hit the ground, someone caught her. The girl, confused as to why she felt nothing as she fell, heard the gasps of the crowd and slowly opened her eyes to their sounds. The saint realized she had landed on something soft. It suddenly dawned on her that it was Chrome's body, and he was lying unconscious beneath her. The girl realized with horror that despite his magic, his body was as fragile as any normal person's. She knew Chrome must have been seriously injured to catch her. He was unconscious, and she tried everything to wake him up. She shouted his name and shook his shoulders, but he didn't respond. This terrified the saint, and she was so scared she couldn't move, frozen to the spot. A frightened referee approached them from behind, flag in hand. He checked on Chrome, but instead of commenting on his condition, he declared George the winner. He noted that Chrome had gone out of bounds during the fall and disqualified him. The goddess's attendants checked Chrome's limbs with trembling hands and determined that both his arms were broken. They called for healers to come to the battlefield. The saint stood to the side, hearing the crowd begin to argue loudly about George's unfair victory. She turned towards the voices and clearly heard their disgruntled murmurs, calling George a weak kid and the whole tournament a joke. The girl realized these words would crush George, so she turned to check on the boy. George trembled like a leaf, his body tense. He heard the crowd belittling him, saying he was unworthy of being a knight, and he held back tears right there on the field. The girl, furious at everyone's behavior, rushed to George to help him, leaving the goddess's attendants utterly confused. George stood alone in the middle of the field, being burned by all the angry stares, and thought that maybe the people in the stands were right. He didn't want to win this way. Winning or losing didn't matter to the boy. He just wanted a fair sword fight to show his skills, and now everyone probably thought he was weak. George himself was starting to believe that he didn't have a shred of pride. But just then, the girl quietly walked up behind him, pulling him from his thoughts. The saint gently approached George and took his sword-wielding hand, which caught the boy completely off guard. She admitted to herself that she hadn't planned for things to go this far, but now that the tournament was over, she couldn't just let it go. She tore off her hair ornament, letting her hair down, and released a wave of divine power to capture everyone's attention. She began her speech, swearing in the name of the goddess that she had been watching the matches and had seen the sincere effort and dedication of the warriors, and the crowd listened with rapt attention. The saint said she would appoint George IV and Chrome as her exclusive knights in recognition of their courage. George tried to argue with her, but the saint quickly silenced him, saying he had no right to question her decision and that she didn't want to hear anything about him being unworthy. The girl praised how well George had done, and the boy began to cry quietly, still holding the saint's hand. She smiled at him, but suddenly heard a rustling sound behind her, and she turned to see the horrible sight of Chrome, battered and bruised, being carried away on a stretcher to the hospital. Chrome remembered the time Lianna showed him magic, telling him to watch carefully and keep his eyes on her. The girl tried to give Chrome some tips on casting, but her explanation was very vague. The boy didn't understand a word, but he didn't say anything. Lianna suddenly jumped up, handed Chrome a bag of food, and said she had to go, as her teacher was probably waiting for her. The boy stared at the bag in confusion. Lianna waved goodbye, promised to bring more food later, and told him to share it with his friends. Chrome woke up and called out to the girl as she was walking away, wanting to tell her his name and ask for hers. His face was bright red. Lianna was startled by his shout, but turned around and introduced herself to the boy, not only giving her full name, but also explaining its meaning. The girl was talking to the old beggar she had just given food to. She said she brought a little extra today and asked him to share it with those who were suffering. The old man thanked the girl sincerely and politely asked her to convey the people's gratitude to Lord Runebelt. Chrome was secretly watching the girl from around a corner, thinking he was well hidden, and leaned out to get a better look. Suddenly, Lianna appeared behind him, almost glowing with a magical aura, and shouted, "Chrome, what are you doing hiding here?" The boy jumped in fright, but Lianna ignored his shock, magically conjured a parcel of food, and said she had been looking for the boy for a long time and was glad to have finally found him. The girl handed him the food and said that if it wasn't enough, he could come to her or her teacher for more. Chrome asked if the teacher and Lianna would have enough food for themselves if they kept sharing with everyone, and if they would be in trouble if the emperor found out and wanted to hurt them. Lianna jumped up very angrily, shouting that such a thing could never happen, and that the Emperor looks down on everyone anyway. Lianna placed a hand on her heart and assured the boy that her teacher could protect her no matter what. Then she broke into a brilliant smile and said, not too seriously, that she was also very strong and could take care of herself. Looking at her confident face and radiant smile, Chrome just thought, my God, how wonderful it would be if I could make this girl happy one day. Lianna stood in the middle of a desolate battlefield, contemplating the meaning of mortal life, gazing at the dust rising from the barren, decaying land. She concluded that the beauty of the world and human happiness were all meaningless, because humans eventually die, and after death, all problems become meaningless. Tears streamed down the girl's cheeks as she turned to Chrome behind her and said she missed her teacher very much. Chrome noted that since Runebelt's death, he hadn't once seen that bright, kind smile on Lianna's face. He decided right then that Lianna would only smile as brightly as she did in her childhood when she achieved her goal. So Chrome resolved to stay by her side even after her death. Chrome simply decided to wait for the girl's reincarnation and kill anyone who stood in her way. Shortly before her death, Lianna told Chrome that she would be reborn in a new body at the earliest the day after her death, and at the latest within 3 years. So Chrome felt the wait wouldn't be too long, and he eagerly awaited their reunion, bringing fresh bouquets to Lianna's remains every day. When news of the saint reached him, he decided to kill the girl, seeing her as an obstacle to Lianna. Chrome intended to kill her himself so that the saints would notice his magic. But just as Chrome was plotting to take the kid out, she and George ran past him, with George urging her to practice her speech. Chrome noticed the way the saint answered George, and how she bolted away from him at the mere mention of rehearsal. Memories of how much Lianna hated memorization and would do anything to get out of it immediately flooded his mind. Chrome understood right then and there that the saint was Lianna. He figured the deactivation of his magic had simply made his senses abnormally sharp, and he had almost instantly detected that the saint's habits and mannerisms were identical to Lianna's. While Chrome was carefully pondering all this, George had already scolded and taken the girl away. But with this discovery, another question arose for Chrome. He tried to figure out why Lianna hadn't returned to Runebelt with Jack, and concluded that she must have forgotten everything. Then he had an even worse thought. He concluded that he meant nothing to Lianna. Chrome was angry, clenching his fists in fury. The man decided that he had to take the girl back to Runebelt. He stood on the small balcony outside her room, waiting for the perfect moment to slip in. He heard the saint start to cry inside the room and peeked in. He heard the girl crying because of a nightmare, and Maria came to comfort her. Chrome watched the girl sadly, then turned away. He decided that if Lianna was living happily here, he should just leave her alone, and then quietly slipped away. Maria called the girl over very happily and gave her a big hug. The saint went straight to her, sank into the embrace, and held on tight. Even after the hug, the tears kept flowing, but as she began to drift off to sleep, a contented smile appeared on her face. Chrome quietly slipped away from the balcony. He decided to pretend not to know her the next time they met. Although he was angry with Lianna, he was still scared enough to rush to save her when she fell, because he respected her. As she tried to wake him, he mumbled not to call his name like a stranger, but she didn't hear. She kept getting closer, but what Chrome saw wasn't the little saint, but Lianna. Her change really bothered him. Chrome woke up after being seriously injured, thinking that he had to cast aside his feelings. Lianna was alive, yes, but she was no longer the person she used to be. He carefully sat up in bed and looked around, realizing he was in a hospital, but he was hardly surprised. Chrome was annoyed with himself for passing out from such a minor injury. He was about to delve deeper into that thought, but then a warmth spread through his palm. He looked down and saw the little saint lying beside him, holding tightly onto his finger and snoring softly. Chrome was stunned, staring motionlessly at the girl. He was overwhelmed with emotion and pressed his lips together, about to do something. But just then a man walked into the hospital, making Chrome flinch, though he didn't let go of the saint's hand. Chrome recognized the man as Bauman, who was once known as the Holy Shield. Chrome's mind flashed back to a young Bauman, but he quickly came back to his senses, realizing that Bauman was old now and could no longer be called the Holy Shield. He was now the Pope. Bauman asked Chrome how his hands were, saying the saint had healed them with her blessing. Chrome was shocked to find his hands completely intact. The man looked sadly at the sleeping saint, and Bauman decided to tell him how the saint had fixed his hair. Chrome cut him off rather curtly, saying he had been disqualified and had no reason to stay. The man got out of bed, put on the clothes he had taken off before the match, said he was leaving, and walked out past Bauman. The Pope didn't turn around or show any emotion, asking, "Is that guy's name really Chrome?" He said Chrome was very much like someone he used to know, and Chrome knew exactly what he was talking about. His face, hidden in shadow, tensed up. Bauman said it had been a long time, and he probably didn't remember much, but some things are impossible to forget. Bauman was very sure that of all the people he had known or fought, Chrome was the strongest and most dangerous. Bauman and Chrome stood there with grim expressions, lost in memories of past years and the brutal battles they had fought. Bauman smiled and said that Chrome was a lot like someone he knew, but it couldn't be him, because the Chrome he knew should be an old fossil by now. Chrome looked at the smiling Bauman, remembering that despite his friendly face, this guy always attacked your weak points without mercy. Chrome clenched his fist, recalling how Bauman had forced Runebelt to retreat, but he replied with a blank face that he didn't quite understand. Bauman said he didn't care who Chrome was, because he had saved the temple's treasure twice, a debt that even the Pope couldn't repay with his life. Bauman bowed to Chrome and asked him to stay with the church, saying it was the saint's wish. Chrome was stunned that this guy, who wouldn't bow to anyone on the battlefield, was bowing so easily to ask for help for the saint's sake. The man realized that he wouldn't be able to sneak Lianna away easily, that he would be watched every moment. Chrome thought about how much Bauman was demeaning himself for the saint, unable to fathom his loyalty. Chrome decided to resort to extreme measures. He asked Bauman if, when he spoke of a hero, calling him the strongest he knew, he was referring to the sin of wrath. He recalled Bauman's title and his own long-forgotten nickname, the Undefeated Sword, and then asked again if Bauman was talking about the sin of wrath, one of the 7 disasters of Runebelt. He tilted his head, his face hidden in shadow, and asked with a dark smirk if Bauman meant that this Chrome was very much like the sin of wrath. The Pope straightened up, glared at the man, and was lost in thought, preparing to give Chrome an answer. But he was interrupted by the saint, who suddenly woke up, immediately drawing everyone's attention, and started complaining that it was too noisy. Bauman asked if the girl was awake. The saint responded with a mumble, rubbing her eyes and yawning sleepily. The girl told the Pope her mouth was dry, and upon hearing this, the man immediately offered to go to the kitchen to get her something to drink. Chrome watched Bauman walk away, feeling that their conversation had definitely gone in the wrong direction and that he might be in a very bad spot now. He decided to walk over to the saint's bed and ask if she had slept well while she stared at his face with sleepy eyes, not recognizing him. She woke up with a start when she remembered how she had healed Chrome yesterday and then fallen asleep beside him. The girl looked at Chrome with fear in her eyes. She felt very uncomfortable talking about what happened at the tournament, but the saint felt she had to say something, so she tried to start topic. Chrome sighed in disgust and said she didn't live up to his expectations. He thought she was the incarnation of the goddess, but she was just an ordinary child. The saint was angry, but Chrome continued, saying she was weak, that he had wasted his time on her, and that the whole thing was a setup by him to expose her. Chrome cleared his throat, saying she really didn't need to thank him. He just regretted not realizing sooner that she was a weak child and had overestimated her. The Saintess trembled with anger, screaming shrilly that she knew a lot, far more than her master. Chrome knelt before her, smiling. She realized she had been played and calmed down a bit. Chrome confirmed he knew who she was and called her by her real name, Lianna. She got angry again, frowning and clenching her small fists. She asked Chrome when he had found out. The guy said he knew immediately, adding that she hadn't changed a bit, and neither had her terrible personality. Lianna lost control again, screaming that she was already being very restrained. Chrome stuck out his tongue, teasing her, but he quickly changed his attitude, placing a hand over his heart. The reason Chrome believed she would be reincarnated was because she had promised in her past life to return to him. Chrome threw a question at her that caught her off guard, asking why she hadn't returned to Runebelt, and Lianna silently weighed her answer. She had to confess that she couldn't find the forbidden magic her master had left nearby. She couldn't find the magic because Bachman refused to give her information about it, saying she was still too young. Lianna would only be able to find the forbidden magic after she came of age, when all the secrets of the temple would be revealed to her. Chrome gazed at her thoughtfully. Lianna was trapped in this small, clumsy body, living in ignorance. Even reborn, she remained loyal to her master and still wanted to find that forbidden magic. It was as if she were tightly bound to it. If this was the force that drove the Saintess, then all Chrome could do was follow her. He knelt before her, kissed her small hand, and swore to always be with her until the very end. He agreed to everything she wanted. He only wished for her happiness and promised to support her in everything. She looked back at him in astonishment, carefully pondering his words and her current situation. Chrome, not planning to return to Runebelt, was stressing Lianna out, so she decided to ask him about it. He was taken aback by the question. He remembered the Saintess begging him to stay at the temple, pleading with him not to leave, and telling the attendants how important he was to her. Just then, Bachman walked in. The Saintess, who had no memory of saying any of this, decided he had been bad-mouthing her behind her back. The girl lunged at him in a rage, ready to teach the disrespectful old man a lesson and show him who was boss. The person Chrome cherished so much was alive and well in this world. He no longer had to wait for her return. These thoughts, mixed with the Saintess's angry shouts, made Chrome feel happy, and he began to grin, laughing softly. The Saintess's knights were holding a formal meeting in a hall of the temple. Chrome, dressed in his new uniform, looked down at young George with interest. The boy looked up at Chrome with the opposite expression. He was a little nervous, which was evident from his tense face. The knights formally greeted each other after bowing. George approached Chrome and asked very quietly if he could ask a question he had been wondering about. Chrome simply nodded, and George asked him how old he really was. The guy was taken aback. He had intended to lie, but this time he decided to confess his age. George was not ready to hear such a large number. Chrome was 68 years old. George III walked in, impressed by Chrome's confidence and strength. He asked Chrome to protect the Saintess from any threats. George III believed the attackers were likely from Runebelt, citing Jack as an example. But Chrome disagreed, thinking it might be an inside job, that someone in the temple might be targeting the Saintess. George was dumbfounded, but his father told him to calm down. He said it was also a possibility, as not everyone was fond of the Saintess. Just as they were discussing their plan, the Saintess walked in. She recalled the attackers' conversation and deduced that they wanted to replace the Pope. The girl paused, gazing at Chrome's face and sizing up his clothes. The man simply looked back at her. Chrome looked good in his new uniform, and the Saintess told him so. Chrome thanked her for the compliment. They quickly moved on from pleasantries to business, discussing the attack on the Saintess. George watched from the side, feeling jealous. The only one who would benefit from Bachman stepping down as Pope was Friar Omar, who was next in line. The Saintess was trembling from cold and fear, but she tried not to show it, telling everyone to be careful and stay out of Omar's sight. George noticed the girl shivering and was about to take off his own cloak for her, but he was too slow. Chrome beat him to it, draping his large cloak over the Saintess's shoulders. She was still a little cold, but sincerely thanked Chrome for his concern. Watching all this, George was completely at a loss. Without even trying, Chrome had all but pushed the boy away from his Saintess's side. Chrome knew the Saintess too well. This unsettled George, because he had known her for 5 years, yet he couldn't respond to her needs so quickly. And Chrome, who had been by the girl's side for less than 5 weeks, could understand her instantly. Plus, he was strong and smart. It seemed there was no place for George by the Saintess's side anymore. The more he thought about it, the more depressed he became, and he started to feel unwell and told the Saintess. The girl worriedly asked him where it hurt and what was wrong, wanting to heal him. But the goddess's power couldn't mend emotional pain. George understood this, and to avoid embarrassing himself in front of the girl, he heroically rushed out of the room. He just needed to cool down. The boy felt terrible about what he had done, because the Saintess was worried about him, and he had completely lied about his feelings due to some foolish insecurity. George III chased after his son, while Holly and Chrome commented on young George's poor disguise. They moved to a table where Chrome fed the girl some cake. They talked about George's behavior, and Chrome couldn't help but compare him to Beatrice. Holly didn't like the comparison, but she agreed it was true. Beatrice used to complain whenever Lianna gave Chrome more attention than her. The reason for George's strange behavior was likely the same as Beatrice's. Chrome said it bluntly, but Holly didn't react at all. Chrome didn't care about George's problems, so he dropped the subject and continued to silently feed Holly. They returned to their speculation about Omar, but the guy was currently swamped with ledgers, which served as his primary alibi. Chrome and Holly were back to square one. They still had no suspects, and the girl fell into deep thought. The girl decided to think like a criminal and had Chrome put himself in the criminal's shoes to devise a plan. The guy thought back on everything that had happened. After 2 failed attempts, security had been tightened, and it was now impossible to get close to Holly. Chrome used an analogy, imagining Holly as an unreachable tree he needed to cut down. As he racked his brain for a way, he noticed the flowers at his feet, flowers from the clearing where the sacred tree stood. This made him think that next time they wouldn't come for the Saintess herself, but would target those around her, the people she cared about. The idea caught the girl's attention, and she grew tense, mentally running through the people she cared about, trying to figure out who was most vulnerable. Maria was always surrounded by people, so a direct ambush was nearly impossible. They might go after Chrome or Bachman, the Saintess's close knight friend, or the Pope, the leader of the temple. But if they dared to do so, it would be a miracle if the attackers survived an encounter with those two powerhouses. People around the Saintess could become easy targets, as no one would expect an attack from behind. The moment the Saintess thought of George's safety, the attackers pounced on the defenseless, crying forth son. A bright flashlight beam appeared before it terrified George. The boy yelled at his attackers to stop. He shut his mouth when they shone the flashlight directly into his eyes. George squinted against the bright light, his face contorted. When his vision cleared, he looked around the dark room he had been dragged into, confusedly trying to figure out who these people were. They introduced themselves as servants of the temple. George even knew some of them personally, while others were just familiar faces. He realized with horror that they weren't just ordinary servants, but priests, all of them men under this Mr. Omar. The men laughed like hyenas, admitting their loyalty to Mr. Omar and giving the child a malicious smile. George accused them of attempted murder, which they didn't even bother to deny. They believed murder was the best way to save the temple. They were trying to save the temple from a witch hiding behind the Saintess's mask, but the only witch George knew was Lianna, and she had been dead for a long time. The child thought the accusation against the Saintess was pure nonsense, and the men laughed at his naivety. One of them asked George if he really thought she was a Saintess, and hadn't he noticed anything strange about her? George recalled all the girl's eccentricities. He felt she acted as if she had lived more than one life, which gave George some strange ideas. He was getting close to the truth, and the robed figure walked up to him, urging him to keep thinking along those lines. Then he began trying to convince the child that the Saintess's appearance was just a foolish conspiracy by Bachman to seize the highest position. His attack on Bachman was so fierce it completely caught George off guard, and the guy's claims were simply outrageous. As it turned out, Mr. Bachman had nothing to do with this conspiracy. He was only in charge of the money and wasn't trying to change the temple's hierarchy for his own benefit. These men were telling the child too much, trying to pull him to their side. They wanted him to help them overthrow the Pope. They laughed like madmen again, demanding the child say out loud that he would join them. But they were met with only silence. The child shouted, defending Omar and Bachman, men who, for better or worse, were completely dedicated to the temple. He would not let them be slandered. He accused them of trying to manipulate him and slandering the Saintess. He would not tolerate anyone disrespecting the girl. But the men couldn't stand his shouting, and one of them grabbed the child by the collar and slammed him against the wall. George couldn't fight back against him. The assassins were frustrated that they couldn't convince George. He just wouldn't listen to them, and they certainly weren't going to listen to him. The only way these men saw to resolve this misunderstanding was to kill the child. One of the killers reached for his knife, and George braced for the attack. Suddenly, something behind them shattered and exploded with a bang, and sunlight flooded the room. Chrome stood in the hole in the broken wall, looking down on these losers. They were so stupid they hadn't even managed to cover their tracks. A terrified Omar was right behind him, furious because these men had forged his accounts and caused him a mountain of trouble. Chrome strode toward George, casually tossing the knife-wielding guy aside. As he untied George, he explained that he had found him by following the clumsy trail left by these amateur kidnappers. The Saintess herself was leading the search party. She was very worried about you. Chrome handed the boy his small sword. He had planned to deal with the criminals himself and let George rest, but the boy wanted to teach them a lesson. After hearing them slander the Saintess, he couldn't just stand by. Chrome and George prepared to attack. The boy's eyes burned with determination. He would defend the Saintess's good name with everything he had. Let's start this fight. Omar watched blankly, wanting to remember every second of this moment to write in his memoirs. Thanks to the two top knights, the masterminds behind all the assassination attempts were found. George IV was saved, and the whole affair came to an end. The day after happened, George invited Chrome to the training grounds, to improve his fighting skills. Chrome won again, but George wasn't discouraged at all. He was almost cheerful. The boy was in awe of Chrome's Chrome's strength, glad that he hadn't met him as an enemy. Chrome was a little surprised by his optimism. Chrome asked George why they were sparring. The boy admitted, a bit embarrassed, that he was jealous of Chrome's swordsmanship and strength. He wanted to fight Chrome without holding back to learn the skills needed to protect the Saintess. Chrome was impressed by his honesty. He didn't even try to hide it. The boy's ambition made him genuinely happy. The Saintess knew how hard George was trying, and she really did need him. So Chrome extended a hand to George and asked him to keep up. We can't leave the girl alone for too long, and since she enjoys George's company, he needs to be by her side as much as possible. Both George and Chrome wanted to protect the Saintess, and they would follow her like loyal knights, protecting her from any danger. Word spread that the Saintess now had a new knight bodyguard. Peace had finally descended upon the entire damn continent. But the news also reached Rune Belt and the ears of an angry Beatrice. She called Chrome a traitor without a second thought. She swore to destroy everything about Asperia, Chrome, and the Saintess. So much for lasting peace. Lianna and Chrome were eating in a small restaurant that looked 50 years old, but Lianna swore it would stand for another 100. She truly hoped to meet Chrome again in this restaurant in her next life. Her words were forever seared into Chrome's memory. Now a grown man, he was happily eating lunch in that same restaurant, enjoying the same snack Lianna used to buy for him. It was crowded and noisy, and Chrome blended right in. But the chef recognized him and thanked him for visiting again. The chef knew Chrome's true identity and had helped him enter a competition without raising any suspicion. He did it to thank the calamity mages and witches who had freed the people from that monstrous emperor. At the thought of this, Chrome's face darkened. He wished Lianna's spirit could hear the chef's words. She was always so worried about the people she couldn't save. Just as Chrome was being consumed by dark thoughts, the same chef appeared again, bringing him a complimentary snack as a sign of respect. His son started to complain that the snack was quite expensive, but the chef yelled at him, saying Chrome was an important figure and couldn't be treated poorly. Chrome looked at the snack that was brought to him. It hadn't always been so expensive or considered a luxury. But now, this fruit, which had neither taste nor nutritional value, was only served to special guests. The Saintess was hurrying down a hall toward a room where the goddess's attendants greeted her and invited her to take a seat. They wished the girl a pleasant meal and praised her for her hard work in class and her academic progress. The Saintess sat down in a chair, cheerfully thanked everyone, promised to enjoy the meal, and gave everyone a sweet smile. The attendants commented that the girl was getting cuter every year and that her smile made each of them feel healthier. But it wasn't just the Saintess who was getting better and better. George burst into the room, out of breath, yelling for the Saintess to wait for him. George IV was also starting to blossom. He was clearly growing up, his appearance and personality gradually changing. He scolded the Saintess for running around alone, especially when she only had one bodyguard left, and she retorted. The attendants drooled over how handsome the boy was, counting down the days until he came of age. They said George was the most handsome guy in the temple, but one of them wasn't buying it. He argued that Chrome was the most handsome man there, and had a solid argument to back it up. The man said he had recently delivered breakfast to Chrome's room, but Chrome didn't answer or open the door for a long time. And when the door finally opened, Chrome was standing there wearing only a bath towel. It completely blew the attendant's mind. It had been years since that incident, but he still couldn't get the image of a half-naked Chrome out of his head. Meanwhile, the Saintess was freaking out because there was less food on the table. George said he didn't see what the big deal was. She got even angrier when she noticed the melon was missing. George didn't think it was a tragedy, saying the fruit wasn't that great anyway. The Saintess was furious and started pounding on George. She was enraged by his nonchalant attitude and ordered him to go get melon. George gave in, begging her to stop. Melons had become incredibly expensive recently, and there was no way he could get one. The fruit being expensive sounded like a lame excuse. I mean, the temple wasn't that poor. The attendants could totally afford a damn melon. The child was starting to realize something was going on in the temple, and that was why they were short on money. She asked George about it, but the boy just said, no, nothing was wrong, and the Saintess didn't need to worry. Hearing this, the Saintess's expression changed. She closed her mouth and pressed her lips together. In all her lives, she had heard this line countless times. Every time she died before growing into an adult. So the child's entire life was just childhood and not even a real one, the kind where you get to learn things. Every time, it was the adults who decided everything. Lianna had thought this life as the Saintess would be different, but it turned out to be the same old crap. George was watching her face like a hawk. He couldn't hold it in and started spilling the beans about what was happening in the temple. The thing is, it wasn't the temple's fault. There was a bigger problem. Chrome reached into his inner jacket pocket, pulled out a newspaper, and handed it to the Saintess, saying that reading it should make her understand what was really going on. The Saintess's face contorted as she read the paper. Her eyes widened, and she stared at it with disgust and disbelief. Meanwhile, in Rune Belt, Jack angrily slammed a stack of the same newspapers on Beatrice's desk. He wanted to know where all these articles came from, articles that were definitely written by Beatrice. The girl glared at the mage, not even trying to hide her authorship, and in fact, seemed proud of it. A young Beatrice stood before her family, all her relatives praising her, calling her the most outstanding child in the world. Born into a noble family, she was spoiled from a young age and excelled at everything. Being the best was a given for her, but she lived in a bubble, and when she met someone stronger, she couldn't compete. That fateful encounter shattered all her beliefs about her own invincibility. That stronger person even refused to fight her, which Beatrice took as an insult. Lianna's power enveloped Beatrice, dozens of times stronger than any of her previous opponents. Beatrice knelt helplessly before the girl, unable to say a word due to the rage consuming her from within. It seemed someone had appeared who was much stronger than her. Beatrice couldn't tolerate this, and Lianna had caught her attention. The articles were all bad-mouthing the Saintess and her melons, saying she was using them for money laundering. Beatrice denied everything. Jack didn't believe it. He knew how much effort Beatrice had put into scouring the entire continent for all the melons just to drive up the price. Beatrice listened to his arguments calmly, sipping red wine from a goblet. Jack was trying to provoke her. He got the reaction he wanted when he mentioned Chrome in his rant. The guy who wrote a letter asking them not to bother the Saintess. Beatrice crushed the glass in her hand. She was furious, telling Jack to shut up and never mention Chrome again. The traitor's name was like nails on a chalkboard to her. Jack liked the Saintess too, but at least he had stayed in Rune Belt, which was why Beatrice was slightly more lenient with him. She flashed a ring, reminding him who was in charge here. Wine mixed with blood dripped from her hand. Beatrice was in charge of Rune Belt now, and Jack had to play by her rules, no complaints. And if he did have complaints, Beatrice would talk to him, but only after he finished the mountain of paperwork. The girl was on Jack's case because he was always shirking this work. He was never used to using his brain, always relying on his pretty face. Beatrice was fidgeting, biting her nails to the quick, while Jack, who had taken Chrome's place, kept an eye on her. He figured he'd better leave the already angry Beatrice alone and get to work. He had a mountain of documents to deal with. He had full confidence in Chrome's skills and knew he could protect the Saintess, but he was worried about the change in the Queen's personality. The stuff in the newspapers was a sham, but Beatrice's plan was working. Melon prices skyrocketed, and people were even stealing from the temple. Now, even George's family had no melons, so the Saintess had to make do with other fruits until the situation calmed down. She was clearly not happy about it, but there was nothing she could do, so she started gobbling up other, equally healthy fruits. Suddenly, an idea struck her, and she smiled, throwing her arms around George's neck. She asked young George how he knew so much about the melon news and the temple supplies if he didn't care about the fruit at all. The cat was out of the bag. When she felt George tense up under her hands and try to push her away, she knew he was on his way to get a melon, so the Saintess wouldn't be too sad without one. She knew it, so she was deliberately teasing George. The child was right. George couldn't argue and tried to slip away, but he couldn't shake the Saintess. In the middle of her attack, she saw Chrome approaching and asked for his help to stop George from escaping. But Chrome pulled her off the boy instead, and she got angry, saying she was just trying to play with him. Chrome ignored her, and George made a quick escape, putting as much distance between them as possible. The boy's face was beet red. He was super embarrassed. The Saintess was still determined to catch him, which terrified George, so he ran for the door. The Saintess feigned illness again, feeling confused. She told Chrome to let her go, but he didn't budge, only saying they needed to talk. He called her by her real name, which made Lianna nervous, preparing herself for a serious conversation. Chrome and the Saintess were discussing the fake news articles spreading like wildfire among the populace, and this was just the beginning of their problems. Accusations against the Pope and the Saintess were piling up, and if this continued, the church's donations would dry up. Donations were the church's main income, and if people stopped donating completely, the whole place would go bankrupt. The Saintess realized from the byline that the article was written by Beatrice, and she praised her for using such a clever way to deal with her enemies. The old Lianna would have done the same thing. It was she who taught Beatrice to defeat her enemies by any means necessary. But things were different now. She knew everyone in the temple cared about them and wouldn't let them be humiliated like this. The Saintess felt much better, knowing exactly how to handle the problem, and told Chrome to gather everyone for a counterattack. The Saintess dreamed of her own death. She was coughing up blood, dying from poison, and heard someone laughing at her. This was her death in a past life, when she was an artist poised to become the genius of the century. In that life, although poor, Lianna was happy. She had her paintings and her best friend, and wanted for nothing else. But her best friend was driven mad by jealousy and killed her to take Lianna's place. At the time, Lianna couldn't understand her motive and was utterly shocked by what her best friend had done. But the girl was cold and ruthless. She cruelly murdered Lianna because she wanted to be the artistic genius of the century, and Lianna was in her way. Just as the memory cut off at the moment of death, the Saintess woke up with terror in her eyes. Chrome had been watching over the sleeping girl. He knew at once that she was dreaming of her past lives again. Whenever she dreamed of them, she would sob in her sleep and then wake up to cry alone so as not to disturb anyone. Chrome brought Lianna some warm milk, hoping it would help her calm down quickly and get some proper sleep. She had a big day tomorrow, confronting Beatrice, and the thought of it made her nervous. Lianna didn't think Beatrice's behavior was strange under the circumstances. It was entirely possible she thought Chrome and Lianna had abandoned her. Chrome still thought she was wrong, but Lianna actually praised her, saying she was a strategic thinker with unusual methods for defeating her enemies. Thinking of Beatrice, Lianna connected her actions to the way her former best friend had acted. The two were almost identical. Recalling all this put her in low spirits, because that friend had murdered her, and Beatrice might do the same. In all her past lives, she had never had a peaceful death. Someone always killed her, and she was afraid that this time it would be Beatrice. At dawn, reporters from all over flocked to the Asper Temple, chattering about the rumors of its impending bankruptcy. The Saintess's reputation was terrible now, so the reporters were nervous as they entered the temple, expecting to see some little demon. But when the great doors opened and the Saintess's radiant face hit them with its light, their eyes nearly popped out of their heads. She looked like a living incarnation of the goddess Asperia herself, sitting calmly on a chair in the middle of the hall, thanking them for coming all this way. She was practically hypnotizing them with sweet words, and the men were desperately resisting, not wanting to fall under her spell. But it was futile. Her aura was affecting them. The Saintess's beauty and smooth talk worked like a charm, though to be honest, her divine power helped a lot too. Everything was going exactly as planned. The men were captivated. The Saintess contacted the newspaper companies to clarify the facts. She was trying to turn the reporters to her side, so they would write an article praising her. They started questioning her about the melon articles, and Bachman interjected to answer, but was cut off by her. She wanted to handle this herself. She played the innocent role, saying she was just an ignorant child with much to learn, trying to win the reporter's support. For as long as she could remember, melons had been considered useless, tossed around like trash, but she had always loved them. But if loving melons was a sin in this world, she was willing to plead guilty. The reporters were stunned by her words. They wanted to know if the Saintess was really making money from melons, but they miscalculated and got no answers from her. Just then, Georg appeared out of nowhere. The reporter's attention immediately shifted to him. The boy reported to the Saintess his return from patrolling the territory. The men began to openly discuss his victories in the first and subsequent tournaments. In their eyes, the boy deserved his position. They suddenly fell silent when they heard the Saintess formally thank the embarrassed-looking Georg, who was kneeling before her. The girl began to praise Georg's kindness, and he, in turn, carefully praised the Saintess in front of the reporters, swearing loyalty to her until death. The men could never have imagined that this scene was staged by the Saintess and Georg just for them. It was quite difficult for the boy. The Saintess enjoyed the performance and sincerely hoped that every reporter would go back and write a story retracting their previous articles. She hoped these articles would restore her dignity in the eyes of society. But what she got was another false article claiming she was having an affair with George. Now, the situation was even worse, and it was almost impossible to change their minds. The church would lose its income, and the Saintess's plan was ruined. The Saintess was furious. tearing the newspaper to shreds and cursing Beatrice, who must have had a hand in this. If the reporter's original stories had actually been published, Beatrice's plan would have failed completely, but she had bought out all the newspapers to prevent it. Those articles had portrayed the Saintess in a glorious light. The reporters talked about her extraordinary charm, her power, and how sincere she seemed. The description of her aura and charisma reminded Jack of Lianna, who always possessed those qualities. Beatrice asked if Jack was talking about the queen. He confirmed it, and she flew into a rage, berating him for daring to compare their queen to the enemy. Jack's face darkened. He knew the Saintess's true identity, but he couldn't tell her directly, as he would never break his promise to Lianna. He asked if his words bothered Beatrice, hoping she would say yes, but she gave him no response. Beatrice clenched her fists, seething with uncontrollable anger. The similarities between Lianna and the Saintess disturbed her, but she already had an explanation and believed it firmly. In her mind, the evil Saintess had forced information about Lianna out of Chrome just so she could imitate her. Now that Lianna was gone, Beatrice had to be the best. The thought of it infuriated her, and another brilliant plan began to form in her mind. Maria came to the Saintess's room to brush her hair before bed and noticed her heavy sighs. The Saintess was wondering if she was really the goddess's incarnate messenger. Maybe it was all a mistake, and she was just an ordinary child. Maria was startled by her words and asked for confirmation, wanting to be sure she hadn't misheard. The Saintess thought of the articles that attacked her, calling her a fraud. The temple was suffering because of them. They said she wasn't the real Saintess, and donations were drying up. None of this would have happened if she hadn't been reborn into this body. After listening to the Saintess's worries, Maria began to laugh softly. This really annoyed the girl. Maria reminded the Saintess how she had stayed up all night reading newspapers to learn how to respond to the reporters' vile attacks. It wasn't just Maria who knew of the Saintess's efforts. All the temple servants did. Maria told her not to worry, because regardless of the rumors, the temple servants cherished her and would always support her. The girl was flustered by such words and blushed, murmuring a thank you to the very calm woman, who just continued with her task. In any of her lives, Lianna had never received parental love. No one had ever cared for her, and only Maria and her teacher had given her that feeling. In her previous life, Lianna had pushed herself so hard to learn magic and become as powerful as her teacher that she had actually fallen ill. She desperately wanted his approval and to learn forbidden magic. Lianna kept asking how she could gather as much mana as her teacher. Each time, the man stubbornly repeated that there were only two ways to gain power, a point the girl remembered well. The first was to seek knowledge on her own and concentrate it within her body. But the teacher never told her the second way, and this time he still wouldn't say. The girl would have to discover that method for herself one day. The second method was likely for one person to transfer their mana to another upon death. Lianna remembered inheriting her late teacher's power, and she then connected that situation to Beatrice, who wanted to kill her and had even killed her in a past life. This nightmarish thought made the Saintess wake up in a cold sweat, her eyes filled with fear. But it wasn't just the nightmare that woke her. Omar's shouting also played a part. He told the Saintess that a wealthy lady had arrived that morning, ready to donate a large sum of money, which woke her up instantly. The Saintess didn't believe the noblewoman's story, but Bauman said her donation was to support the Saintess's love, as mentioned in the recent article. The wealthy lady wanted to meet the Saintess. Bauman and Omar pleaded with her to smile, make a good impression, and hit the jackpot. The Saintess, who didn't even believe in love, found it ironic to receive a donation in the name of love, especially after all the vicious articles. She began to think about the dreams she'd been having lately, all this stress, and decided to solve the money problem first, so she could at least stop worrying about that. The Saintess decided to meet the noblewoman, whose family was famous before the empire's collapse. Without warning, she heard a voice she knew all too well, which nearly scared the soul out of her. As the voice called her by a new name and thanked her for the meeting, everything before her eyes began to blur. Standing before her was Beatrice from the Graham family. She was an expert at playing innocent, and you couldn't see her true colors through the fancy clothes. Beatrice stared at the Saintess with a flash of pure rage in her eyes and thanked her for the audience. The Saintess before her forced a nervous smile, frozen in place. The whole thing was both comical and terrifying. The dreams that had been plaguing her were actually prophetic visions. The Graham family had been wiped out when the Empire fell and the war began. Omar was shocked that a survivor from that family had appeared. The Saintess wasn't surprised at all. She knew about Beatrice's immortal body and how she had survived, just like Chrome. Chrome had also appeared in the holy city of Asphyria. Beatrice had completely concealed her magic, hoping to get rid of the Saintess without being noticed. But there was no way she could endanger the girl's safety. The paladins guarded the temple day and night, and they would spot trouble quickly. The Saintess's face darkened at the thought that Beatrice must know the temple was heavily guarded. In that case, the purpose of her visit remained a mystery to the Saintess. Beatrice noticed a shadow on the girl's pensive face. She asked if the Saintess was angry with her, pulling the girl from her thoughts. Beatrice put on a dejected look, pretending to understand why the Saintess would be upset by her sudden visit, and made a show of leaving with her offering. The Saintess couldn't let that happen. The temple situation didn't allow for refusing cash of any kind. She wanted to kick Beatrice out, but for the money, she gritted her teeth and swallowed her pride. The Saintess desperately wanted to know why Beatrice was playing this charade, so she forced a smile and acted cordial. She had to invite Beatrice into the temple and wish her a pleasant time, all with a cold poker face. After that, in the Saintess's eyes, Beatrice turned into a complete monster, smiling like she'd won the lottery. This Saintess from the holy city of Asphyria, who was supposed to be holy, noble, and charismatic, was just a cheap imitation of Lianna, and Beatrice was going to slowly crush her soul before finishing her off for good. First, she wanted to shatter her pride and leak stories about how the girl bowed down for money. That would ruin her reputation. As a gift for their first meeting, Beatrice wanted to give the Saintess a little something as a sign of friendship. The gift was a joke. The box looked large and ornate, but inside were only a few coins. Beatrice wanted to humiliate the Saintess, to see the look on her face when she, expecting a chest full of cash, saw it was half empty. The servants noticed the weight of the box as they picked it up, but before they could react, the lock broke and everything spilled onto the floor. The Saintess's eyes widened as a mountain of various treasures poured out onto the floor at her feet. Beatrice panicked. She hadn't expected so much treasure. This box was supposed to disappoint the Saintess, not make her happy. There were enough jewels to fill the entire treasury with cash, and on top of that, there were tons of other chests filled with gold. The Saintess thanked Beatrice for her generous gift, noting that it must have been prepared by someone who knew her very well. Beatrice started making excuses, blaming it on a fictional younger brother who was supposedly infatuated with the Saintess. She said the Saintess might refuse such a lavish gift, but the girl cleverly replied that she intended to keep all of it for herself. The girl was furious. She remembered clearly how those jewels got into the box. It was Jack Casanova who put them there the night before they left. He had specifically asked Beatrice to deliver this gift to the Saintess by hand. He even wanted to travel to Aspera himself, but Beatrice wouldn't let him. During Beatrice and Chrome's absence, Jack was the only one who could use his soul power and shape-shifting abilities to fill the void in Runabelt. She had wanted to refuse his request to deliver the gift too, but Jack said it was an official request from a calamity mage. He insisted that she deliver his gift. Beatrice just looked down on him for getting in the way of her preparations. Beatrice agreed, thinking there was no way Jack could have a worthwhile plan. She decided to ask him why he was suddenly paying attention to the Saintess. Jack had always been in love with Lianna, and even now, his feelings for the Queen hadn't changed. But Lianna had never loved him back. Jack didn't think it was a big deal. For him, it was enough to be able to express his feelings to her. Lianna herself could never love him, which Jack realized when they first met. She started beating him up with fire magic because she couldn't control her power and the forest nearly went up in flames. Jack begged her to stop, as normal people don't just attack others on sight. After he spoke, Lianna seemed to come to her senses. She looked at Jack with clear eyes and asked who he was. Throughout the fight, she had seen him as the Emperor, and she was completely terrified when she found a normal man at her feet. Recalling the incident, Jack smiled foolishly and began to justify his new infatuation. You can't command your heart, right? So, this little gift from a loyal fan, Saint Jack, completely screwed Beatrice over and nearly ruined her plan. But Lianna had always taught Beatrice to never give up, to defeat her enemies by any means necessary, and proved it with a game of chess. If you're out of options, Lianna advised attacking the enemy's sore spots to provoke them. Once these blows to their self-esteem accumulate, the opponent will slowly lose faith in himself, and then he will come crawling to Beatrice. Beatrice listened intently and asked what to do if even that didn't lead to victory. She nervously started biting her nails again, because her opponent might be better even at chess, which she had only learned yesterday. Lianna pulled Beatrice's hand away from her face and told her not to overthink it. But the girl was constantly worried about the possibility of losing. Lianna swore that even if a chess prodigy stood in Beatrice's way, they wouldn't stand a chance, because no one was smarter than Lianna at this game. Since she was the one who taught Beatrice to play, no one on Earth should be able to beat her. So when she lost during her visit to the Saintess, she was completely stunned. A little kid had wiped the floor with her. The Saintess sat on her chair with a smug look right in front of the dumbfounded Beatrice. It was she who had suggested the chess game, and she didn't regret it one bit. At first, Beatrice had jumped at the chance to play, thinking it was a great opportunity to show off her skills. But the Saintess was superior in every way, from playing chess and drawing to singing. Instead of shattering the Saintess's pride, Beatrice had helped her win even more respect from her followers. And chess had always been Lianna's strong suit. She was the best at it. But now, the Saintess was as if mocking Beatrice, imitating her late queen in every way. Beatrice saw this pointless imitation of her mentor Lianna as a personal insult. At this rate, Beatrice would end up failing and returning to Runa Belt empty-handed. So she decided to try another approach. She stopped a few servants in the hallway, saying she wanted a minute of their time to share some special sweets. A few hours later, the Saintess began to get ready for bed, collapsing onto the bed in her room, exhausted. The girl let out a heavy sigh, which confused Chrome, who was beside her. She had thoroughly defeated Beatrice, but she still wasn't happy. Her victories were meaningless because they couldn't stop the fake news, the melon prices, or anything else. They were futile. The girl asked Chrome why he hadn't told Beatrice the truth about her real identity all this time. The man decided to get ready for bed first, as it was late and that kind of conversation could go on forever. He had been living in the temple for a long time, and he'd had countless opportunities to tell Beatrice everything. Nothing was stopping him from sending all the information in a letter. If Chrome had sent the letter, the temple wouldn't be in this mess. But Chrome did try to send Beatrice a letter, but she didn't take it seriously, thinking the story in it was ridiculous. Chrome's letters were never answered, so now they were in a situation where all channels of communication were cut off. Even Lianna herself didn't have the courage to tell Beatrice the truth in this situation. But she couldn't just stand by and watch the temple collapse. Chrome suddenly came up with a plan to protect the temple from Beatrice, and the Saintess was very excited to hear his idea. Chrome suggested she return to that world as Lianna and persuade Beatrice in person. If the Saintess returned to her body in Runa Belt, she could also regain her original powers. Then she wouldn't have to play the Saintess anymore, and the temple would be safe. Lianna found the proposal quite tempting. She wanted to go back to Runa Belt, but she couldn't just abandon the temple. Chrome grabbed her hand, and she flinched. He didn't want to lose her because of the temple. The temple needed her, just as the people of Runa Belt needed her. And so did Chrome. He missed Lianna terribly. He couldn't help but squeeze her hand a little tighter. Her family was in Runa Belt, among the Calamity mages, not here, not in the temple, not in the holy city of Aspera. Chrome begged her not to forget that. Memories of the good old days with Lianna flashed through his mind. She looked at him as if, for a moment, she had returned to her past life and was reliving those good old days too. She was about to say something to Chrome, but a loud knock on the door interrupted her, completely surprising both her and Chrome. They both went to the door and asked who it was, as it was late and no one usually visited the Saintess at this hour. From behind the door came Beatrice's loud voice, which the Saintess recognized immediately. She apologized for the late visit and asked the girl to open the door. Beatrice stood there, holding a tray with tea, a malicious smirk on her face, asking the Saintess for a moment of her time. She had found some fine tea leaves and brewed them especially for the Saintess, as she was returning home tomorrow. That was why she had barged into the Saintess's room so late. She really wanted to spend a little more time with her. Food delivered this late was never just food. The Saintess detected a faint scent from the tea. Beatrice had put a potion in it, one that Lianna had told her about, something that forces a person to speak only the truth. Anyone who drinks that potion will feel a pain, faint but unpleasant, the moment they lie. So Beatrice planned to use this to find out exactly why this girl was impersonating Lianna and get rid of her if necessary. But a doubt still lingered in her mind, and she remembered the day she spent with Lianna before she died. Back then, Beatrice had brewed her tea, just regular tea, and brought it to Lianna's studio. Lianna refused it, trying to lie that she didn't like tea, but Beatrice saw her hands trembling. Now she sincerely hoped the Saintess wouldn't imitate the Queen in even this small matter and would just drink the damn potion. But the tea before her sent Lianna into a full-blown panic. She tried to remain calm, but fear seized her by the throat. The person who had poisoned her in a past life was completely different from Beatrice, and what was in the tea wasn't even a fatal poison. But remembering her friend's brilliant smile during that cruel murder, Lianna began to compare her to Beatrice and doubt everything. She didn't know what would happen if Beatrice truly decided to offer the tea, and Beatrice was indeed putting immense pressure on the Saintess. When Beatrice started to press her, Lianna couldn't take it anymore. She lost control of her emotions and flew into a rage. Having lost her senses, Lianna swept the teacup and saucer off the table, shattering them and splashing tea everywhere. Beatrice was furious, not expecting the other to imitate the Queen's appearance so vividly. She froze in place, speechless with anger. Lianna was also stunned, trying to comprehend what she had just done. Sweat began to trickle down her tense face. The girl began to apologize to Beatrice, but it was too late. Beatrice stood up and looked down on the Saintess. Beatrice cursed at the Saintess, calling her a disgusting impostor, a worthless fake. Her anger burned like a green flame. Beatrice leaned back and raised her hand toward the Saintess, preparing to attack with magic. The Saintess stumbled backward, but Chrome suddenly appeared in front of the girl, heroically protecting her with his own power. Chrome struggled to block Beatrice's onslaught. Her accumulated magic was too immense. It was impossible for her to have become this strong in just a few years. Chrome realized Beatrice's magic was stored in the necklace she kept touching. She had not come unprepared. Chrome was at a disadvantage here, and he knew it well, shouting at the Saintess to get away. The magical energy slammed into the man, throwing Lianna aside, while Chrome was sent flying straight to the other side of the room. Beatrice used her power to lift him into the air, choking him by the neck and completely cutting off his air supply. Her first instinct was to eliminate him. She could already taste victory. But then, something distracted her, she thought. She should first deal with the real reason she came here. The Saintess tried not to show her nervousness. If Beatrice continued her rampage, a squad of holy knights would burst in. This was what allowed the Saintess to calm down. But then, Beatrice dropped a naive bombshell. She had drugged the holy knights. They had all eaten the sleeping pills the girl had given them, something the Saintess had not expected at all. Beatrice was powerful, but she was nearly helpless against so many enemies. So she had resorted to a cunning plan, distributing the laced candies like a fool. Everyone in the temple had happily eaten her candies, which just proved to Beatrice how foolish and gullible they were. Now she could easily eliminate the Saintess without any witnesses. She lunged forward, ready to attack. But her power didn't even reach the Saintess before it was blocked by a far more powerful divine force. Beatrice was completely stunned. So this child really was the Saintess. Beatrice found it hard to believe. The Saintess was glaring at her with a deathly stare. Magic and divine power are opposing forces, but to be clear, divine power is the stronger of the two. Lianna had repeatedly stressed this to Beatrice, as they had once fought against the holy nation of Aspera, where there were many people with divine power. Priests were difficult to deal with unless attacked with extremely powerful magic. That was why Lianna had told Beatrice to run if she ever encountered a priest. She was very worried about her and had sworn to strike down anyone who hunted Beatrice. The girl had never forgotten that until now. Even the slightest blow against the Saintess's shield brought her incredible pain. This child's energy was far stronger than hers. Beatrice understood this after the first few attacks. The girl was so powerful that Beatrice couldn't harm her in the slightest, even with all her magic. Anger began to build, and sweat dripped from her face. Without a doubt, this Saintess was the real deal. She couldn't be an impostor. Even just looking at the child, you could see a bright light radiating from her. But Beatrice couldn't stand the child's audacity. The Saintess shouldn't be imitating the attitude of an enemy queen and looking down on her like that. Beatrice attacked the child again, but the Saintess didn't even blink in the face of the powerful blow. She wanted to unleash all her divine power at once and strike Beatrice down, but Chrome might get caught in the blast. So all the Saintess could do now was defend, even though Beatrice's attacks never ceased. It might eventually hurt the girl. The Saintess was conflicted. She couldn't believe Beatrice wanted to eliminate her so badly. Perhaps Beatrice didn't want to harm the Saintess. Her purpose in coming to the capital was likely just to provoke her. If she had wanted to kill the girl from the start, she would have put poison in the tea, not a truth serum. But now Beatrice couldn't think straight and just kept attacking. Who knew what had enraged her? Her pendant shattered, her hands trembled from throwing punches, and sharp pain shot through her body. Beatrice could barely stand. Chrome tried to reason with her, begging her to stop fighting before she got hurt. But Beatrice just screamed at him, calling him a traitor. She couldn't let the Saintess live, because in her eyes, the Saintess had deeply insulted Lianna and didn't deserve to exist. This little brat, who wasn't even worthy of kissing the queen's little finger, dared to imitate her. And what's more, the Saintess was Lianna's enemy. Beatrice would eliminate her and level the holy capital, finishing what Lianna couldn't. Her arms grew weaker, and she could no longer attack, merely muttering that she wanted Lianna's approval. The girl's head drooped, and she could no longer lift it. She was completely powerless now. But the Saintess didn't try to stop or attack her, just watched Beatrice in surprise, waiting to hear what she would say next. Beatrice thought she was finally going to die. She had failed to kill the Saintess and would never see Lianna again. Unexpectedly, the Saintess began to apologize for the pain she had caused, kneeling down and taking Beatrice's hands in her own. Beatrice asked her to say it again, but the Saintess just kept apologizing. She was sorry she hadn't been able to convey any of her feelings to her, causing her so much pain. All Beatrice wanted was to be acknowledged. That was why she had waited so long for Lianna, why she had gone to Aspera to assassinate the Saintess. She had no idea Lianna had been reincarnated into that body, and it wasn't until the Saintess's words sounded so damn familiar that she began to understand. While cleaning up the spilled tea, Lianna and Beatrice talked about one of Lianna's past lives, where she had been poisoned by tea. That was why Lianna didn't accept tea from any strangers, why she had knocked over Beatrice's tray, and why she now felt so ashamed. She began to apologize to Beatrice, but Beatrice just covered her hands with her own, cutting her off as if to say Lianna had nothing to apologize for. Beatrice thought her hesitation was completely understandable. She understood and accepted Lianna's actions. It was Lianna who had helped a broken and desperate Beatrice get back on her feet, so there was no way she could be angry with her. She promised that even if Lianna began to doubt Beatrice herself, she would not hate Lianna. She pleaded with Lianna not to blame herself for anything. It was Lianna who made Beatrice see how special she was, instead of just being obsessed with becoming the strongest. Lianna took off Beatrice's gloves and was a little dismayed to see she hadn't broken her habit of biting her nails. She did that when she was stressed, and it was at that moment that Beatrice recognized the Saintess as her queen, the girl who had helped her become herself. That morning, Beatrice had promised to solve the Melon Price issue and correct all the articles. She basically controlled all the publishing houses now. Lianna pointed at Beatrice's swollen eyes, complaining that she had forgotten to use a cold compress after crying all night. Lianna couldn't stay silent about it. She spoke frankly with Beatrice, even in front of the priests, because they never listen anyway. Only now did Beatrice realize how Jack had hinted that Lianna had been reincarnated as the Saintess, but she had missed his clues. So when she arrived in Aspera, she had expected to see a cheap imitation of Lianna, not the real person. The Saintess wanted Beatrice to flick Jack's forehead for not telling her directly about the Queen's reincarnation, but she refused. Jack had been afraid of exposing her, because the assassins were still out there. Hearing this, the Saintess remembered her own suspicions of Beatrice and began to apologize, but Beatrice cut her off again. It wasn't the Saintess's fault for being so suspicious. External forces had made her that way. So Beatrice refused to accept her apology for last night or for her past doubts. The Saintess looked at her gratefully and lovingly, accepting her friend's words and vowing never to do that again. Last night, the Saintess had revealed her true self to Beatrice, finally clearing up all the misunderstandings. She had pleaded with Beatrice not to hate her, but the girl had just pulled her closer and hugged her tightly. Beatrice sobbed uncontrollably, repeating Lianna's name over and over while holding the girl tighter. The Lianna of the past would have told her to stop crying, but now she just stood there comforting her and then started crying herself. After they both had a good cry, Chrome and Beatrice repaired the ruined room, bickering constantly the whole time. Meanwhile, the Saintess ran around the temple, erasing everyone's memories of the night so they wouldn't be suspicious in the morning. They worked frantically all night, but the Saintess found the time spent with her friends to be quite enjoyable. The Saintess told Beatrice she planned to wait until she came of age before going to acquire the forbidden magic. Beatrice wasn't too keen on the idea, though. She had no choice but to accept Lianna's decision and go home, hoping the queen would get what she wanted soon. Until she returned, Beatrice swore to protect the temple and never leave without a good reason. This was definitely a jab at Chrome's behavior. The girls were all laughing at the man's irresponsibility. They laughed even harder when Beatrice mentioned a helpless Jack. Beatrice had gained Lianna's approval, and she was in control of the situation. Lianna's words had melted away all her anger. She thanked the Saintess for the time they spent together, saying it felt like a blessing. Beatrice wished the girl all the best, and Lianna and Chrome listened with interest to her parting words. Beatrice smiled brightly, wishing the Saintess good health as she said goodbye, and then left the temple full of joy. Shortly after Beatrice left, the fake news incident was resolved as if it had never happened, and peace and tranquility returned to the holy capital. And the Saintess began her history lessons, taught by Bachman himself, who enthusiastically told her about the history of the Empire's division into 4 kingdoms. The girl found these lessons to be the most boring thing she had ever experienced. She was constantly distracted and couldn't concentrate at all. She herself was practically a living encyclopedia, yet they made her spend hours every day repeating things she already knew. At least little George was listening intently to these boring stories, as he knew almost nothing about history. Lianna always watched him, marveling at how focused he was. He really reminded her of George, too. It seemed there was no escaping genetics. After class, she confirmed that George was indeed interested in these things. She grew bored of the conversation and decided to look for Chrome. But she didn't see Chrome all day. It was as if he had disappeared. George said that Chrome had suddenly taken a leave of absence, which greatly confused the Saintess. If Chrome needed to go somewhere, he always told her. But this time, he hadn't even mentioned leaving. It must have been something very urgent. The Saintess tried to recall where he might have gone so quickly. He had traveled to Runbolt, where a group of his old friends was already waiting for him. Every one of them looked unusually serious, with shadows cast over their faces. Some of the Calamity mages weren't there in person, but they were online. Chrome formally thanked everyone for coming and declared the meeting and reports to have begun. The Runbolt Magic Council was a gathering of sorcerers that only Lianna and the 6 Calamity mages could attend. But after Lianna's death, the purpose of the meeting changed. Now, even Calamity mages who had left the kingdom years ago were meeting in Runbolt. When the Calamity Council heard reports, Jack was always the first to speak, bragging about his peerless beauty that only grew more outstanding with age. Then Beatrice would talk about how she learned to sign documents with both hands, and then some unknown mage would gloat about his business investments. It was all nonsense, and it was driving Chrome mad. He couldn't take it anymore and started yelling at the mages. These meetings after Lianna's death were supposed to be for finding the bastard who had hurt her, but these people were just making small talk. Chrome was furious. He began to scold them, but Jack interrupted, saying it was all pointless. They had been searching for the killer for over 60 years and still didn't have a single clue. The outcome of these meetings was always the same, and everyone was sick of it. The cause of Lianna's death was unknown. By the time the mages found her, she had already passed away. On that day, all the mages realized just how useless they were. They couldn't even protect their own queen. There were no signs of a break-in. Either someone had used magic far beyond all of theirs to get in, but no mage in the world was stronger than Lianna. If you put all the clues together, you'd arrive at a very interesting conclusion, as Jack pointed out. There was a traitor among the Calamity mages, a traitor who had killed the queen 60 years ago and still hadn't been found. After some discussion, the mages were back where they started. They had nothing, no facts, not even a decent theory. Chrome had always thought all the mages were united in fulfilling Lianna's wishes, but it turned out someone had betrayed her, and the mages as well. The meeting ended, and Chrome returned to his office to find an unpleasant surprise. His desk was a complete mess. He was furious. Beatrice was ashamed that Jack had made such a mess, while Jack started making lame excuses. Beatrice explained that things had piled up, and only Chrome knew how to handle them. They couldn't count on Jack at all. Jack tried to show off a beautiful paper swan he had left on the desk, which only made Beatrice angrier. Chrome tried to calm his friends down and calmly sat down to the documents, which were now covered in doodles and completely illegible. Jack and Beatrice asked him why he was acting so strangely and concluded it was because of the meeting earlier that day. They started to giggle at Chrome, trying to make him laugh, but he kept a straight face, lost in serious thoughts only he knew. Beatrice pointed out that this meeting was different from the others. This time, the three of them knew about Lianna's new reincarnation. That must have been why Chrome was so tense. Jack laughed even harder, finding it amusing that Chrome's head was full of Lianna. Chrome said nothing to his companions, just snapped his fingers and magically blasted them right out his office, then slammed the door. You see, he was very worried. He didn't want to go through the pain of losing Lianna again. So Chrome needed to bring her back to Runbold as soon as possible. But recalling her reaction to that idea, Chrome began to doubt himself. She had said she didn't want to leave Aspera because she was surrounded by love and care there, and the forbidden magic was there too. But the Calamity mages had to find Lianna's killer before she grew up, before the killer found her again. Chrome put these thoughts aside for now. First, he had to deal with this mountain of paperwork. If George, too, were in Runbold, he would have finished this stuff in no time. He was a natural at this kind of work, but he never attended the meetings and had disappeared from the Calamity mage's sight long ago. His seat had been empty for too long. No one had seen the guy since Lianna's death. He was devastated when he found out she had passed. Chrome didn't even know if he was still alive. It bothered him, but he had more important things to deal with, so he went back to his documents. Meanwhile, the Saintess was in her history class when she was told about an upcoming pilgrimage to a holy site, which caught her completely off guard. Bachman announced with a huge smile that the Saintess would be traveling to a small town called Esplanade, where there was a holy spring. He had mentioned the place countless times in class, and he was very excited about it. But the Saintess didn't share his enthusiasm at all. She hadn't been listening to him and had no memory of the town. Luckily, an unknown man appeared and saved her from Bachman. He was a holy knight from Esplanade named Joseph, and he was delighted to finally see the Saintess in person. He had been assigned to protect her during this year's pilgrimage and assured her of his support. He told her that other Saintesses had walked the earth before, including the first Saintess, Galatea. The original Saintess had settled in Esplanade and ended her journey there after a long life. This was precisely why the current Saintess needed to visit Esplanade. She had to see for herself the land where the first Saintess had lived. The Saintess didn't see the point of using a grand word like pilgrimage to describe a trip to a neighboring town. But according to Joseph, the journey to Esplanade would take about 15 days, and at the Saintess's walking pace, it could take a full 30. To walk that path and reflect on your life, that was the meaning of a pilgrimage. But the Saintess absolutely hated the idea. She wanted to take a carriage. Joseph told the Saintess not to worry about the hardships of the road, as George would accompany her. But the Saintess objected again, as George was as young as she was. The girl didn't understand why she had to go through such hardship. She didn't like this trip one bit. Part of the reason was that while the Saintess began to save the world, Lianna was dying over and over again in a constant cycle of reincarnation. There were even times when Lianna died before she could even let out her first cry. It was a miracle she hadn't gone mad after all that. The girl resented the gods for giving her such a life and didn't understand their intention of having Lianna follow in the footsteps of the goddess's incarnation in this life. Joseph tried to get the Saintess interested in the trip. He knew something about the forbidden magic the Saintess was so fascinated with. Lianna was indeed interested in the fact that Esplanade kept records of the forbidden magic. So the girl began to question Joseph and found out that the city had archives on everything that happened in the Empire and the state of the kingdoms after the war. Esplanade had records on the life of Galatea, the birth of the holy nation of Aspera, and of course, the history of the forbidden magic. The Saintess decided to double-check with Bachman, and when he confirmed it, she flew into a rage at the guy. Bachman could have told her about the records, or even shown her the forbidden magic directly, but he just kept saying she was too young. There was no getting through to this stubborn guy, and searching for the magic in the capital was futile. She had already searched every inch and found nothing. All that was left was to seize this one and only lead to the forbidden magic. So the Saintess agreed to the pilgrimage. She was so excited about finding information on the forbidden magic that she immediately rushed off to pack and ordered everyone else to start preparing at once. George chased after the girl, who was already running ahead, but he had to stop when Joseph called him by his old name, Luke. But that was no longer the boy's name. He had inherited the family title name, George. Joseph realized his mistake and apologized to George. They hadn't seen each other in a long time, so Joseph suggested they talk. He was the kid's uncle, after all. George had grown quite a bit since Uncle Joseph had last seen him. Joseph had heard his nephew even had the Saintess's support. George acted humbly, saying people were hyping him up too much. But Joseph wasn't buying it and continued to pile on the praise. With a sly smile, Joseph decided to get straight to the point. He thought this pilgrimage was the perfect chance for George to win the Saintess's heart, especially with Chrome out of the picture. In the past, the George family had immense influence, but George too had ruined everything. The reputation, the honor, all of it was gone. But now with the birth of the Saintess, the George family had a chance to regain its former glory. Joseph was pushing little George to marry the Saintess one day. It was the only way to wash away the family's shameful past. George wanted to argue. He wasn't keen on the idea, but Joseph gave him a murderous look, and the kid shut up, unable to say a word. His uncle was belittling him, telling him not to let the Saintess end up with Chrome or some other loser. He was really brainwashing him. Joseph told George to man up and think of himself and his family first. He reminded him that he was now the family's only hope. So don't screw it up. George's lips were sealed. He was well aware of how long their family had suffered for George II's disgrace and what Uncle Joseph wanted. But he didn't want to stoop to that kind of solution because it was nothing but manipulating. The Saintess's feelings. The George family. They were a family of holy knights, loyal to the temple for centuries. The husband of Saintess Galatea had even come from this family. A prestigious family of holy knights, where only the best and bravest were worthy of bearing the name George. The Saintess was walking around the temple, looking for young George, but he just wouldn't answer her calls. George and Joseph spotted the girl. The uncle started pushing George even harder, telling him to go to her side now. He placed his hand on the kid's shoulder, calling him the family's last hope. That kind of manipulation only made George's head hang low. After the family's honor was dragged through the mud, George walked toward the Saintess. The name George having become a shackle, a burden a child was forced to bear. Bachman told the Saintess she was on a walking pilgrimage, but she could clearly see a carriage right in front of her. They lied to the girl, saying it would take 30 days, and she flew into a rage, pouncing on the Pope and starting to punch and kick him again. Maria appeared and explained the situation to the girl. She and Bachman were practically begging for a break, as the Saintess was far too young for such a long journey. The Saintess thanked Maria, then remembered that Esplanade was George's hometown, and when he walked over, she asked him why he had never told her. The boy gave a lame excuse, telling the Saintess they would be leaving soon, and then walked away, leaving her very frustrated. The girl was starting to get suspicious. George's whole vibe was off, like he was being deliberately distant. Something she didn't know about must be going on. The Saintess told Maria she was worried about George, but Maria thought he was just stressed out because he hadn't been home in a long time. The Saintess thought to hell with that because she had never been to Esplanade before either, but she wasn't freaking out. Maria understood what she meant. As it turned out, this was also Maria's first time in Esplanade, which greatly surprised the Saintess. Maria was super embarrassed because she was a priestess and should have visited the Holy Land at least once. Maria had always been just an ordinary child, and when other priestesses were transferred to larger churches, she remained in her small chapel. But Maria was happy. She had her family and great friends, and she never even dreamed of going to the Holy Land. Then, by a stroke of luck, she was transferred to Holy Aspera, where after all this time, she finally met the Saintess. The girl listened, completely captivated by the woman's story, shocked by the crazy twists and turns in Maria's life that had nearly upended it. The Saintess realized that Maria, who had been taking care of her all this time, had never left the holy capital, which meant she had never even stepped outside the temple walls. At this thought, the girl suggested Maria take a vacation after their trip, which greatly surprised Maria. The Saintess didn't want Maria to suffer because of her. It was just awful to make a woman work non-stop without any time off. Maria started laughing at what the girl said, which annoyed the Saintess, as she couldn't help but worry about the health of those she cared about. But Maria was laughing because, among the temple staff, the Saintess was the second person to say such a thing to her. In a gloomy and suffocating place, like the temple, there was another person who was saying the right things. The Saintess, intrigued, asked who that person was. Maria shyly replied that her first love was the first person to worry about her getting rest, and the Saintess's jaw dropped, ready for a juicy story. The Saintess shrieked with excitement, startling George, who was walking outside, and she pleaded with Maria to tell her everything about this romance, which flustered her even more. Contrary to the Saintess's expectations, it turned out this person was not the friend Maria had mentioned earlier, but a knight she recalled with a smile. When Maria was 10, these legendary knights appeared at her small chapel for the first time. She was very impressed, and one of them remained forever in her memory. That was their first meeting. To her, he was like a prince from a fairy tale. His skills, his physique, everything about him. When Maria saw him, she was completely captivated and couldn't take her eyes off him. Some strange feelings began to sprout in her heart, but by the time Maria realized it was love, he was already gone. She never told him, but she always cherished that feeling. The Saintess had never seen a woman so flustered. The knight she had a crush on was probably an old man by now, and she was still in love with him. The girl decided to help Maria reunite with this person. She couldn't help but ask, "Who is he?" Maria thanked the girl for her kindness, but a reunion was impossible. He had left the temple long ago, and she didn't know where he was now. Just then, George IV spotted something unusual on the road and shouted for all the servants of the goddess to be on alert. The carriage came to a screeching halt, and the girls were terrified when they heard George's scream. They were very worried about the boy and the other servants. The Saintess was terrified, wondering what could be happening outside. She really didn't want to lose her 101st life. It turned out she had worried for nothing. Now, the Saintess and George were crammed into a small carriage, and George couldn't go outside. The reason was a strange man who had stopped the carriage earlier. He was the cause of all this chaos. The moment they dragged him into the carriage, Maria completely forgot about the Saintess and rushed to help the man tending to him. They had found him on a mountain road to Esplanade. He was filthy, emaciated, and had no one to help him, so the priestesses decided to intervene. George had to stay in the carriage because, as her bodyguard, he couldn't leave the Saintess alone with a stranger. They decided to take the man to the city. The Saintess couldn't understand why Maria would help such a weirdo. Just then, the man woke up and asked who had saved him. Maria said she was from the temple, and the man called her and people like her meddlers. He clearly hated being with priestesses. His attitude annoyed the Saintess. She told him to watch his mouth, and if he couldn't be grateful, at least not be rude. He made her so angry that she decided to heal him with her holy power to make him recover faster and realize what he was doing. But the man forcefully slapped her hand away, terrifying George and Maria. The boy was ready to jump in and protect the Saintess, but the man just froze and told her not to touch him. His slap had turned her hand bright red. The Saintess was too shocked to speak, hating the stranger's behavior. He wouldn't listen at all and just turned to face the wall. Then he called her a fake Saintess. This enraged her, and she started screaming, with Maria barely stopping her from attacking the man. The Saintess was furious that Maria was holding her back. Her patience was running out, and this guy was about to cross the line. Maria's only argument was that the stranger was sick, which was why he was acting this way, and he just needed a priestess's help. The Saintess was speechless. The Saintess stormed out of the carriage at the first opportunity, slamming the door so hard she didn't even notice. Bumping into Joseph, she left Maria alone with the man, planning to cut through the forest to Esplanade and get there first. God, what a terrible day for the Saintess. Maria was having a tough time with the stranger, and she couldn't help because he was completely ignoring her. But what really annoyed her was that during their argument, Maria had sided with the stranger instead of her. To be honest, it wasn't surprising that Maria favored the sick. She loved taking care of people. She was just a kind person. Suddenly, someone called out to the Saintess. The girl thought Maria had come to her senses and finally remembered the Saintess's existence. She turned around with her eyes closed, thanking Maria for her concern and for all the effort she put into caring for her. But it turned out it wasn't Maria who had caught up, but George, sent by the woman to protect the Saintess while she stayed behind with the stranger. It had been a long time since Maria had seen the Saintess act so willfully. She really wanted to help the man and couldn't just leave him alone to chase after the girl. The woman got into the carriage and had the man sit up so she could bandage and treat his wounds. He must have been in a lot of pain. The stranger had several broken ribs, but he endured the pain as he was bandaged. No one could truly heal him now because holy power was dangerous for him. Maria was able to figure this out because she sensed magical energy from the stranger. Having spent her life in the temple, she had learned how to distinguish between magicians and ordinary people. The man didn't react to this, simply asking what Maria wanted for helping him. The woman wanted him to prove his gratitude with his actions. The stranger didn't want to repay the help with work. He tried to scare Maria with his identity, but to her, he was just a patient now. Maria understood that this man hated the temple. He was very stubborn, but she was still determined to help him. Part of the reason she was so insistent was that this guy looked exactly like the knight who had saved her as a child. The guy didn't believe her, so she decided to tell him a story from her childhood. It was a story about an ordinary child, someone who didn't excel in any way and had no special talents. At the orphanage, they named her Maria. She was like any other child, and her best friend was named Sophia. The girls were always together until one day Sophia went missing. She wasn't the first child to disappear, and Maria knew they wouldn't find her. Rumors of missing young acolytes spread quickly. Maria was terrified by the thought of Sophia being gone. She hoped her friend was just lost, and she became more certain when she saw Sophia's silhouette in the woods. Maria chased after her, calling her name over and over. She was so happy that her friend had suddenly returned. Maria finally caught up and grabbed Sophia's hand, trying to stop her, but the girl just kept running. Everyone was frantic about Sophia's disappearance, and no one knew where she had gone, so they thought she had just vanished. Maria begged her to come home, but then Sophia turned her head toward Maria, and it turned out the girl had no face, only a mass of black slime where her face should have been. This Sophia monster let out a terrifying scream and began to move toward the backing away Maria. The monster lost its human form, towering over Maria and reaching for her with a giant clawed hand. It raised its hand to strike, and Maria, unable to move, froze in terror, bracing for the blow. But suddenly, a man emerged from the forest, the light from his sword giving Maria a glimmer of hope. This knight saved her life and would later become Maria's first love, a man she could never forget. Upon arriving in Esplanade, the Saintess noticed that all the people in town had red hair, and they all greeted the girl with great joy. The Saintess mistook everyone in town for members of George's family and, wanting to ask her bodyguard, accidentally mistook some boy for him. The journey from Aspera to Esplanade took 4 days, and the Saintess was tired, so she was really happy to find such good food in this rural place. A mountain of delicious dishes was laid out on the table before the girl. Someone wished her a good appetite, and the Saintess happily dug in. George, worried about her, told her to eat slowly to avoid indigestion. The woman came up behind George without a care. She hadn't eaten at the same table with him in a long time, so she really hoped he would eat a lot. The woman turned out to be George's mother, and he thanked her sincerely, showing a smile he hadn't in a long time. The Saintess was happy to see these changes in the boy's behavior. He was finally relaxing around his family, whom he hadn't seen in so long. But the Saintess's happiness lasted only until she heard Maria's voice, who was genuinely happy for the lucky girl. The Saintess had been giving Maria the silent treatment ever since the incident in the carriage, but it was one-sided. The Saintess wasn't speaking to her. The man they had rescued on the way to the city was given lodging and some help, so the Saintess hadn't seen him since they arrived. But the girl was very happy about this. The eyesore was finally gone. For now, the Saintess was busy enough as it was. Late at night, the Saintess opened her room's window and threw a rope to the ground, which she had made by tying together bed sheets, tablecloths, and other fabrics. The rope was very strong and easily held the girl's weight. She felt this escape method was a piece of cake. The notes on forbidden magic were hidden right under the Saintess's nose, and this knowledge kept her up at night. The previous evening, the girl had asked George's mother about forbidden magic, which greatly excited the lady. The Saintess's thirst for knowledge amazed her. The lady revealed that the records of forbidden magic were hidden in the clock tower library. The Saintess tried to inquire about the tower's location, and George's mother happily explained everything to her in detail. The tower was in the western part of the Esplanade Forest, and the Saintess eventually reached it. The tower loomed over the woods, and she gazed at it, convinced that within this tower lay the magic that could finally break her cycle of reincarnation. The Saintess walked forward with determination, but accidentally snapped a branch, the sharp sound catching the attention of a stranger by the lake. The guy was cooling off by the water, washing up and shaving, thinking about the story Maria had told about the knight who saved her. He reminded Maria of that night, but honestly, she didn't care if he was the same person or not. She just wanted to pass on the kindness she had received from that night as a child. So Maria hoped he would pass on this kindness, suggesting he help others as repayment for her aid. The guy was trying to cut all ties with the temple, but his damn code wouldn't allow him to be indebted to someone without repaying them. He heard footsteps approaching his hiding spot as the Saintess made her way toward the tower. The Saintess was startled when she saw him. She could barely recognize him without the dirt on his face, and his timing was just terrible. However, the guy thought he had heard some kind of wild animal moving around, and he said so out loud, standing up from the stump he was sitting on. The Saintess had heard words like that before. The scene, the situation, and the man's voice all felt very familiar. It all brought back memories of someone she knew when she was the Calamity Queen of Ruinbird. The girl projected the words and image of her old acquaintance onto this man, even noticing the physical resemblance. She was sure she knew him. Everything clicked into place. As the man stared at her with a stern gaze, the Saintess had a revelation. She fell into an awkward silence for a few seconds, sizing up his slightly changed appearance in shock. She couldn't believe her eyes. Without a doubt, standing before the girl was George II. When the Saintess voiced her suspicion, he flew into a rage. George threw a punch at the girl, slamming her against a tree with immense force and immobilizing her. He couldn't risk the priestess's discovering his true identity. Now that the Saintess knew his true identity, George couldn't let her go. She would tell the servants of the goddess everything. He had to kill her. The girl bolted, but he wouldn't let her escape. A stone thrown by the man flew toward the Saintess. At an astonishing speed, she was saved by pure luck. She tripped and fell, and the stone slammed into a tree trunk, shattering the bark into countless small pieces. This man couldn't control his strength, a problem the Saintess remembered from her past life. George wanted to make it quick, but the girl's escape complicated things. She was furious at his disrespect. The girl tried to stop his assassination attempt by revealing her own identity. She wanted to state her true identity, but the man simply wouldn't listen. Then, the Saintess opened her mouth, about to introduce herself as another reincarnation of Lianna, but she stopped, never confessing. What stopped her was the promise she had made to Chrome the day before. The Sin of Wrath had pleaded with her not to reveal her identity under any circumstances, for her own safety. The girl tried to go against this promise because she couldn't suspect everyone she knew from her past life of murder. She didn't want a repeat of the Beatrice situation, and Chrome had actually listened to her on that matter. He had proposed a compromise. She could only reveal her true identity to someone if Chrome was nearby. Some people would be happy to see Lianna return, but others might want her dead, and both Chrome and Lianna knew this. The Saintess had agreed to that vow and now regretted it, because Chrome wasn't around, and revealing her identity would be very useful right now. She was no match for George II. She couldn't even run away. The guy was winding up, preparing to punch her in the face. But the Saintess wouldn't give up so easily. She remembered her holy power and tried to use it to protect herself. The guy was distracted, and the Saintess saw a chance to escape and took it. But it was no use. He caught her and landed a blow. As a former holy knight, George had plenty of experience with holy power, so it didn't hurt him. The Saintess was knocked unconscious by his blow and fell into his arms. George II really didn't want to kill a child, but he couldn't leave a living witness who knew his secret. George II, a holy knight who inherited the sword of George I, had lived his life as a warrior of justice, dedicated to serving the priestesses and believing in everything they did. He had achieved great things and would have served holy Aspera until his death if he hadn't come face to face with Lianna. The disappearances of young priestesses were blamed on a witch, pinning all the continent's problems on her. With these issues and beliefs, people turned to George II, who was supposed to rid the world of this witch with his sword. The battlefield with the witch was terrifying, her insane magic shocking all who witnessed it. Two holy knights couldn't withstand the witch's terrifying power and fled the battlefield, leaving George II to face the threat alone. Those men were too afraid of dying there. But George's gaze couldn't move from the magic that was gradually consuming the entire battlefield. He could clearly feel the magic growing thicker the closer he got to the source, and he tried to imagine what this notorious witch looked like. They described her as an ugly hag with sharp claws, a terrifying monster that ate children, and that's what George expected to see. But his expectations were wrong. This walking disaster before him was completely different from the stories people told. The witch had no terrifying eyes or sharp claws. She was nothing like a monster. George was just standing in front of an ordinary person. The girl noticed him and said it was a misunderstanding and that she thought he really looked like a bear. This enraged George. She was clearly trying to use her appearance to lower his guard, then attack and kill him. But George wouldn't fall for it. The man began to speak to her in a formal tone, trying to intimidate her with his title, but Lianna was unresponsive. She didn't even find it funny. In Lianna's opinion, George II talked too much, so she decided to shut him up, sending him flying with a powerful flick of her finger. George didn't even have time to react to her action. He was trying to draw his sword when Lianna's finger flicked him hard on the forehead. This day marked the moment of Lianna and George's first meeting, but it only remained in George's memory. The girl didn't remember this encounter. After that heavy blow, he began to have a strange dream where the witch was dozens of times larger than any normal person and looked down on George. She called him a little bear again and then flicked him away, and in that moment, George truly felt like a little bear. Just then, George woke up screaming, with a group of people bustling around him, and found himself in the infirmary. The guy was completely lost, tried to figure out how he got here. Then he remembered the witch's attack had sent him flying all the way to the Holy Knight camp. This reminded him of the Holy Knights who had fled, so he asked if they had returned, but the priestesses just thought he was delirious. They blamed his delirium on the witch's attack messing with his head, but George tried to tell them that wasn't the case. George had seen those guys flee in terror with his own eyes, but the priestesses didn't believe him. Great holy knights would not be scared away. They began trying to convince him he was wrong, saying that all holy knights had learned the basics and would charge to the end to kill the witch. They practically forced their views on George, reminding him who the priestesses really were, and that the witch was the sole culprit. They didn't let up until he admitted he was wrong, and then they praised him. But now George began to seriously doubt the temple's actions, and resentment began to fester. From that day on, cracks began to appear in George's faith, and soon it shattered completely, and the man followed Lianna. He tried to imagine what the girl would do in his position, and decided he had to kill the Saintess. After all, if he let her go, she might expose him. George couldn't leave a living witness who knew his secrets. He raised his hand, looking as if he was about to snap the girl's neck and give her a painless death. Suddenly, something stopped his hand, preventing him from carrying out the act. The man turned his head in anger. It was Jack's spirits holding him back. George II was shocked. Jack shouldn't be here at all right now. Loud footsteps echoed through the forest. George realized someone was rushing toward him. He jumped aside just in time, Jack's spirits still not letting go of his arm, and he could only see the dust he had just kicked up. Chrome stood before George, tense and ready for a fight. He held his sword tightly in one hand and effortlessly held the Saintess in the other. Chrome had quickly helped his companions with the documents in Ruinbird, which made Jack very excited, and he begged Chrome to stay in the city. Chrome sternly refused him, but Jack didn't mind that Chrome wasn't staying, as protecting the Saintess was his main mission. So, as thanks for helping with the documents, Jack decided to give Chrome a special delivery using his spirit magic, sending him directly to the Saintess. Jack had used too much energy in that teleportation and was now exhausted. The Saintess was in the middle of nowhere, too far away. The teleportation only succeeded because Jack had attached spirits to the Saintess so he could track her location. Suddenly, the spirits dispersed from the exhausted Jack. He couldn't chase after them, nor could he control his little guys. Chrome also ran after the spirits, noticing something unusual deep in the dense forest. Jack was startled by his sudden action, but he was still chasing her through the woods. Chrome found Georg too about to kill the Saintess and rushed at him, ready to swing his sword. If Georg hadn't let go of the Saintess, he would have lost an arm. He had heard the rumors about Chrome becoming the Saintess's dog, so he wasn't surprised to see him. Nevertheless, Georg hadn't expected Chrome to raise a hand against him for a girl. He was quite disappointed. Chrome was just as unhappy to see Georg, whose actions had angered him. He wanted to know where Georg had been all these years. Georg didn't answer directly, lying that he had been sleeping the whole time. Chrome lost control of his emotions and roared, clearly getting desperate. Chrome believed Georg already knew Lianna had been reincarnated as the Saintess, which was why he wanted to kill her. Georg was fully capable of such a thing. An exhausted Jack finally stumbled out of the forest, furious at having been abandoned by everyone. But when Jack saw a suspicious red-haired stranger and Chrome angrily pointing a sword at him, those feelings all vanished. It dawned on Jack. This stranger was Georg too. He saw the little Saintess in Chrome's arms, who had been bullied, as you could tell from the look on her face. The guy instantly lost his mind, furiously charging at Georg, ready to beat him half to death. Attacking the Saintess was insane. While Jack and Georg too were fighting, the Saintess woke up in Chrome's arms. She was confused, not knowing where she was or what had happened. Chrome's presence bewildered her. Meanwhile, Georg noticed something strange. Chrome had never treated anyone the way he was now. Lianna was the only person he had ever adored. Georg would never forget the atmosphere between them and the scenes he had been forced to witness back then. Chrome and Lianna had spent a lot of time together. She was always quick to lose her temper, and Chrome could always calmly soothe her. And that was exactly what he was doing now, soothing the Saintess, whose behavior Georg found to be too much like Lianna's. Suddenly, the anxious voices of Maria and George came from the woods. They were looking for the Saintess, and the loud noises had scared them. The girl was caught sneaking out, and now she was going to be scolded for causing trouble for the priests. Chrome placed the frightened girl on the ground. The Calamity mages had to leave the girl. Chrome was on vacation, and everyone knew Jack was the envoy of the Rune Belt. They weren't supposed to be here. The girl was afraid to be left alone with Georg, but the mages swore they would protect her from a distance. And Chrome glared at Georg with a murderous look, warning him not to even think about touching a single hair on the Saintess. Georg found the mage's comical antics amusing and just chuckled. And so, Chrome and Jack walked deeper into the forest, leaving the Saintess alone with Georg. Georg cursed Chrome's consistently bad attitude, but the Saintess ignored him, fuming. The girl, burning with rage, began to threaten Georg with lies, saying she would tell the priest he had kidnapped her so she wouldn't get into trouble herself. Her words and actions didn't match her young age. She had a rather calculating little mind, which reminded Georg of someone he knew. He remembered Lianna from long ago, when he had gone to her for a job, and she had called him lazy, saying he couldn't even figure out what he should be doing. Lianna had even given Georg the title of Edler. Recalling this, Georg realized the girl's cunning nature hadn't changed one bit. The guy finally recognized her as the reincarnated Lianna, and the girl was terrified, unable to figure out how he had guessed. An angry George and a frightened Maria emerged from the woods, the boys ready to attack Georg, convinced he was the one who had made the Saintess disappear. The girl thought this was the perfect opportunity to get rid of Georg too, and planned to frame him by saying he had really kidnapped her. But Georg cut the Saintess off. He twisted the truth, painting himself as a good guy, lying that he had tried to take her home, but she had stubbornly kept running into the forest. Maria and George thanked him for his help, feeling deeply ashamed of their own carelessness. They completely ignored the girl's explanation, as her track record of running away spoke for itself. The Saintess couldn't deny it. Maria was very upset. The girl shouldn't be causing trouble so far from the temple. But Maria couldn't stay angry for long. She loved the Saintess too much and was just happy to have found her safe and sound. Nothing else mattered. The Saintess felt very sorry for her willfulness and sincerely apologized for making Maria worry. They hugged and made up as a reward for saving the Saintess. Georg, too, was supposed to receive a prize, but he refused it and asked the girl for a job in return. He lied that he just wanted to repay the girl for her previous help, but the Saintess knew his true identity and didn't believe him for a second. At dawn, the Saintess ordered the guy to go catch fish, 100 fresh ones. Maria thought the task the girl gave Georg was too difficult, but the girl disagreed, saying that if the guy wanted to repay his debt, he had to work for it. She wouldn't forgive the guy for insulting her and didn't want him near her, telling him not to come back until he caught all 100 fish. She wanted to scare Georg off, but the guy's reaction was all wrong. He grinned like an idiot and swore his allegiance to the Saintess. The girl was speechless. She began to tremble. George was stunned by the guy's optimism. No one had ever reacted to the Saintess's orders like this. The Saintess backed away, trying to get as far from the guy as possible, hiding behind George, who just looked at her in confusion. She wanted the boy to follow Georg like a deputy, as an observer. The other paladins could handle guard duty, but no one would agree to monitor this stranger. Only George could do it. The guy grabbed the boy, threw him over his shoulder, and dragged him away. George really didn't want to go, but the Saintess thought it was a good way to reunite George's family. Having Georg, too, around made the Saintess very nervous. She was worried because in her past life, he had always confessed his love to her. On top of that, ever since arriving in Esplanade, everyone had been trying to set the Saintess up with George. The girl hated it. The Saintess decided to figure out why people were doing this later. George's mother was walking up from behind her. She told the girl to follow her. The Saintess was now fully focused on learning forbidden magic. She had been in the city for several days, and today she could finally enter the West Tower. The Saintess's lessons in the tower began. They handed her a large pile of thick books, a collection of Saintess Galatia's diaries. The girl had been reading the boring books for hours, to the point of wanting to throw up, but the priest just kept pushing more on her. George's mother said these diaries would contain information about forbidden magic, which got the Saintess excited. But this surprised the girl. Information on forbidden magic shouldn't be in Galatia's diaries, because it was created by the mage Rune Delta, not a Saintess. George's mother said that was exactly what they were going to talk about. She was going to discuss past cases of forbidden magic use with the girl. Long ago, a person with ill intentions used it, causing a disaster that only Saintess Galatia and George I, working together, could stop. Later, after seeing this historical record, the previous pope deemed forbidden magic too dangerous and worked with Rune Delta to seal it away. He was afraid the power would be used again, and the Saintess knew nothing about this. She didn't think forbidden magic was related to the temple, but rather to her teacher. This confused her because Lianna had always thought her mentor had no secrets from her, but it turned out he had been lying all along. The Saintess was the only one who knew nothing about this crucial information. Her noble status was useless if no one told her anything. Now she had to reevaluate everyone she had met. Many of them probably knew the truth about forbidden magic, but kept their mouths shut. Thinking of this, Georg, too, was the first person who came to her mind, followed by the entire George family. If he knew something, he would tell her, right? Georg, too, was the most loyal of all the Calamities, and the Saintess was convinced of this. Too bad she had no idea that at this very moment, he was attacking George IV.